the Amber Road. It is not a road of stone, but a whisper, a glint of captured sunlight passed from hand to hand across a sleeping continent. We see it now, not as lines on a map, but as a living network of trails moving through the immense dark forests of Neolithic Europe, following the silver threads of rivers like the Vistula and the Elbe. On the cold, wind-lashed shores of the Baltic Sea, foragers wade into the surf after a storm, searching for the strange light stones washed up from the seabed. This is succinite, the fossilized resin of ancient pines that lived 40 million years ago, a substance that feels warm to the touch, smells of pine when rubbed, and holds within its golden heart the mysteries of static electricity as if it were alive. This is the electron of the Greeks, the gold of the north, and it is beginning its long journey south, carried by people whose names are lost to time, traveling toward the burgeoning warmth of the Mediterranean sun. It is a commodity born of ice and ancient forests, destined for tombs of kings who have never seen a northern winter, a simple resin that will bind a continent together thousands of years before the first empires rise. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Our story of connection begins with this luminous golden tear of a prehistoric tree, a substance that held an almost supernatural allure for the people of the Stone and Bronze Ages. The trade it inspired was not a conscious act of international commerce, but a slow, creeping diffusion, a chain of transactions that linked countless small, disparate cultures. A trader in a dugout canoe might carry a pouch of raw amber nodules a few dozen miles upriver, trading them to another group for fine flint tools or furs. That group, in turn, might carry the amber further south over a misty mountain pass to trade for salt or dried meats. With each exchange, the amber moved further from its icy origins and increased in perceived value, its journey mirroring the slow meltwater of a glacier, carving new paths through the landscape. This was not a highway. It was a capillary system, pulsing with the earliest rhythms of human desire for things of beauty and mystery. The routes were treacherous, winding through dense primeval forests populated by wolves and bears, and crossing territories of tribes who might be hostile or welcoming, depending on the season or the omens. Archaeologists trace these invisible paths through the physical evidence left behind, the faint breadcrumbs of a prehistoric economy. The true significance of the Amber Road was revealed not in the north, but in the south, in the dazzling sunlight of the Aegean. When excavators uncovered the shaft graves at Mycenae in Greece, the tombs of the legendary warrior kings of the 16th century BCE, they found them filled with gold, bronze weapons, and intricate death masks. Lying among these treasures, archaeologists unearthed hundreds of beads of Baltic amber, chemically identical to the resins still washing ashore in modern-day Lithuania and Poland. This was the definitive proof, a direct line of contact stretching over 1,500 miles, connecting the supposedly primitive north with the glittering, sophisticated palace cultures of the Mycenaeans. The amber had been polished, drilled, and strung into elaborate necklaces, laid to rest with kings who commanded fleets and built citadels, and its presence there speaks of a connection far deeper than simple bartering. This path was a two-way street, a conduit not just for materials, but for ideas. As the amber flowed south, a new and revolutionary technology flowed north, the secret of bronze. The tin required to make this vital alloy was scarce in the south, but abundant in regions like Bohemia and even as far as Cornwall, areas touched by the northern extremities of these trade networks. The knowledge of how to mine, smelt, and cast tin and copper into tools and weapons, an invention that defined an entire epoch, likely traveled along these same quiet forest trails. Nordic Bronze Age carvings from this period show images of ships and sun chariots that bear a striking resemblance to art from the Mediterranean, suggesting a shared cosmology, a flow of myths and beliefs that moved with the merchants. The amber itself was imbued with powerful symbolism, believed to hold the warmth of the sun and possess healing properties, making it a vital component in amulets and sacred objects far from its home. Even further south, the evidence becomes more astonishing. Amber beads from the Baltic have been identified in Egyptian tombs, including in the elaborate pectoral armor of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, who died around 1324 BCE. This means that this gold of the north had not only crossed the European continent, but had also been absorbed into the even more ancient and powerful trade networks of the Near East, linking the Baltic Sea to the valley of the Nile. The amber found in Tutankhamun's tomb represents the end point of a journey of staggering length, a testament to the interconnectedness of the ancient world. The pharaoh himself would have had no concept of the cold northern sea from which his treasure came, only that it was a rare and magical substance fit for a god-king. This single prehistoric trade route, born of a desire for a beautiful fossil, demonstrates that long before great empires built stone roads, humanity was already weaving a complex tapestry of global connection, driven by curiosity, status, and the timeless search for the things that glitter in the dark. But while this northern route whispered through forests, other mightier routes were already being carved by the great rivers of the very first civilizations. While the amber whispered its way through the quiet northern forests, a revolution was unfolding under a hotter, brighter sun, driven not by footpaths, but by the two great arteries of Mesopotamia. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the rivers of civilization, were the first true highways of bulk transport, turning the alluvial plain of Sumer into the world's first urban crucible. Here in the Fertile Crescent, the land was rich and flat, yielding immense surpluses of barley and wheat, yet it was a land devoid of stone for building, metal for tools, and even strong timber for roofs. This fundamental poverty of resources, set against a backdrop of agricultural abundance, made long-distance trade not a luxury, but the very engine of civilization itself. The cities that rose from the baked mud, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, were built on a foundation of imported goods, paid for by the golden harvests that the rivers nourished. The rivers were the conduit, the lifeblood that allowed these first metropolises to exist, connecting the farmers of the south with the mountains and mines that lay hundreds of miles away. The daily pulse of this economy was the river barge, a vessel that defined the rhythm of Sumerian life. Some were long, narrow canoes made of bundled reeds, waterproofed with the black, sticky bitumen that bubbled from the earth. Others were the iconic kufas, round coracles of hide stretched over a wooden frame, which could be paddled or simply guided by the current. Loaded with the surplus of the fields, these boats drifted downstream, carrying mountains of grain in woven sacks, large ceramic jars filled with sesame oil, and, most importantly, bales of high-quality woolen textiles. Sumerian weavers, mostly women, produced these textiles on an industrial scale in vast temple workshops, creating a manufactured export good that was prized throughout the ancient Near East. These textiles, along with the foundational grain, were the currency that purchased the very stones of their temples. The rivers made this possible, allowing a single barge to carry what hundreds of donkeys could not, transforming localized barter into regional commerce. In return, the rivers carried the world back to Sumer. From the north, down the Euphrates, came cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon, a fragrant, durable timber, essential for the palaces of kings and the inner sanctums of the gods. From the east, across the Iranian plateau, and then down the Tigris, came copper from Magan, likely modern Oman, and tin from Anatolia, the essential components of the Bronze Age itself. But of all the materials that flowed into the shining cities of the plain, one held a value that transcended mere utility, a substance that captured the very color of the heavens. This was lapis lazuli, a deep, celestial blue stone flecked with golden pyrite, quarried from a single remote source, the treacherous mountains of Badakhshan, in what is today northern Afghanistan. This stone began a journey of more than 2,000 miles, carried by donkey caravans over formidable mountain passes, through hostile deserts, until it reached the trading emporiums of Elam or Mari, where it was finally loaded onto riverboats for the last leg of its journey to Sumer. The arrival of lapis lazuli in a city like Ur was a momentous event, the stone destined only for the most sacred and royal purposes. Archaeologists excavating the royal tombs of Ur, dating to around 2500 BCE, were stunned by its prevalence. They found the standard of Ur, an enigmatic box inlaid with scenes of war and peace, its background a shimmering mosaic of this precious blue stone. They found the elaborate headdresses of Queen Puabi, adorned with golden leaves and carnelian, but centered on beads of deep blue lapis. They found lyres played in the afterlife, their soundboards decorated with the sacred substance. This was not just a gemstone, it was an embodiment of divinity, the color of the sky and the deep waters, and its presence in these tombs, so far from its mountain home, is a testament to the power and reach of these riverine trade routes. The Sumerians so coveted this stone that they established colonies far up the Euphrates, like Hababa Kabira in modern Syria, purely to act as way stations, securing the flow of this and other exotic materials. This immense movement of goods, common grain and divine stone alike, created a profound new problem: how to keep track of it all. History's first bureaucracy was born from the need to manage this trade. In the great temple storehouses, clay tokens of different shapes were used to represent quantities of barley, oil, or sheep. But as the volume of trade swelled, this system proved too clumsy, leading directly to one of humanity's greatest inventions. Scribes began to press the shapes of the tokens onto wet clay tablets, and soon they abbreviated those shapes into the wedge-like symbols we call cuneiform. Writing was not invented to record poetry or the deeds of kings. It was invented to be a ledger, a receipt for a shipment of beer, a contract for wool, a bill of lading for a boat sailing from Nippur. The cylinder seal, an intricate personal signature carved onto a small stone cylinder and rolled across the wet clay, was the final piece of this commercial puzzle, the legal guarantee that the goods had been sent or received. This entire intellectual leap, the very dawn of written history, was a direct consequence of the commerce made possible by the Tigris and the Euphrates, rivers that carried not just commodities, but the very seeds of civilization itself, seeds that were already finding fertile ground in another great river valley far to the east. At the very same time that the cities of Ur and Uruk were trading lapis lazuli along their great rivers, another, even larger civilization was thriving in profound, organized silence far to the east. This was the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan culture, a vast expanse of cities and towns that flourished in the basins of the Indus and Ghaggar Hakra rivers in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Its great metropolises, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of urban planning, laid out on precise grids with sophisticated drainage systems, public baths, and multi-story brick homes, all built with astonishingly uniform bricks. Yet, this civilization remains one of history's great enigmas. Its complex script is still undeciphered, the names of its kings are unknown, and the nature of its political power is a mystery. But while their words are lost to us, their actions speak with perfect clarity through the artifacts of their economy, revealing a commercial network of unparalleled scale and sophistication for the Bronze Age, all built on a foundation of absolute trust and standardization. The most intimate and iconic artifact of this culture is the Indus seal. Thousands of these small square objects, typically carved from soft steatite stone and then fired to harden them, have been unearthed. Each seal bears an exquisite miniature intaglio carving of an animal, most famously a mythical unicorn, but also powerful bulls, elephants, and rhinoceroses, along with a short line of the tantalizing, unread script. These were not mere decorations. They were the personal signatures of merchants, property owners, and perhaps officials. When a merchant prepared a bale of cotton or a jar of oil for shipment, he would press his seal into the wet clay tag securing the bundle, leaving his unique, unforgeable mark as a guarantee of quality and ownership. These seals were the Harappan equivalent of a modern trademark, a bill of lading, and a personal signature, all rolled into one small, beautiful object, a silent promise between buyer and seller. The true power of these seals is revealed not by where they were made, but where they were found. Indus seals have been discovered in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, including Ur, which we just visited. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia speak of a distant land they called Meluha, a place from which they imported exotic goods like copper, ivory, hardwoods, and most prized of all, shimmering deep red carnelian beads. Archaeologists are now certain that Meluha was the Mesopotamian name for the Indus civilization. This means that these two great cradles of civilization were in direct, regular contact, linked by a robust maritime trade route that crossed the Arabian Sea, a journey of over 1,000 miles. An Indus merchant's seal, found resting in the dust of a Sumerian marketplace, is a tangible, breathtaking piece of evidence for this ancient globalism, a silent testament to a Harappan trader who lived and worked in a foreign city, thousands of miles from his meticulously planned home. Even more profound than the seals, however, was the discovery of the Harappan system of weights. Across an area spanning more than 600,000 square miles, from the grandest city to the smallest rural village, archaeologists have found caches of perfectly uniform, cubical weights, typically carved from a hard, modeled chert. These weights follow a consistent binary and decimal system, with the base unit weighing approximately 13.6 grams. The system is so precise, so universally adopted, that a merchant from Harappa in the north could trade with a merchant from Lothal, a port city 500 miles to the south, with complete confidence. This vast, regulated system implies a level of economic integration and central authority that is simply staggering for the 3rd millennium BCE. It represents a shared understanding of value, a societal agreement that underpinned all commerce, making trade fair, efficient, and scalable. It was an intellectual achievement, a bureaucratic triumph that allowed this enormous civilization to function as a single, cohesive economic zone without, apparently, the grand palaces and warring kings that defined Egypt and Mesopotamia. This network was facilitated by advanced engineering. At the coastal city of Lothal, excavators uncovered what is believed to be the world's earliest known dock, a massive, brick-lined basin connected by a channel to a nearby estuary. This was a dedicated shipping facility, built to handle the loading and unloading of seagoing vessels, sheltering them from the tidal currents. It was here that the famous carnelian beads, meticulously drilled using Harappan technology, were likely packed for their long journey to Mesopotamia, alongside bales of cotton, a plant first domesticated and woven by this civilization. The Indus people were masters of the sea, just as they were masters of the land, connecting the resources of their vast hinterland to a maritime network that stretched to the Persian Gulf. Their seals and their weights are the quiet, profound evidence of this lost commercial empire, a civilization that built its prosperity not on war, but on a shared, silent, and incredibly precise system of trust. And as their ships plied the Arabian Sea, other even more daring sailors were beginning to master the winds of the Mediterranean, charting a new and powerful maritime web. While the Indus civilization built its silent trust on standardized weights, a new, dynamic power was rising on a narrow strip of coast in the Levant, a people who would come to define maritime trade for a millennium. These were the Phoenicians, a loose confederation of fiercely independent city-states, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, pressed between the towering Lebanon mountains and the deep, inviting blue of the Mediterranean Sea. They were not empire builders in the traditional sense. They did not command vast armies to conquer territory, for the mountains at their back left them little room to expand. Instead, they turned their faces to the sea, and in doing so, they transformed that sea, Mare Nostrum, into the first great highway of Western civilization, weaving a web of commerce and culture that would stretch from the shores of Anatolia to the misty, unknown coasts of the Atlantic. Their ships, sleek and durable, became the shuttles weaving this vast tapestry, and their primary threads were the treasures of their own small land. First, and perhaps most foundational, was the wood from the mountains that penned them in. The slopes of Mount Lebanon were covered in immense, ancient forests of cedar, a timber renowned throughout the ancient world for its fragrance, its deep reddish hue, and its extraordinary resistance to rot and insects. In a world of mud brick palaces and reed boats, Lebanese cedar was a strategic, almost sacred commodity. The pharaohs of Egypt, whose own land grew only soft palms and acacia, coveted this wood above all else for their monumental temples, their royal barges, and their funerary sarcophagi. As early as 3000 BCE, the port of Byblos, whose name would later give us the Greek word for book, biblion, and ultimately Bible, grew rich supplying cedar to the Nile kingdom. This trade was so ancient, so fundamental, that Egyptian texts speak of Byblos ships as a generic term for any seagoing vessel, a testament to the city's dominance in this vital trade, all built on the strong, sweet-smelling heartwood of their mountain forests. But the Phoenicians' most legendary export was not a raw material, but a manufactured luxury, a color so rare and so potent it would come to define power itself. This was Tyrian purple, a dye of unparalleled vibrancy and permanence, ranging from a deep blood red to a dark, shimmering violet. Its source was a humble sea snail, the Murex brandaris, which secreted a single drop of yellowish fluid from a gland. The process of creating the dye was agonizingly slow and notoriously foul-smelling. Phoenician dye works were always located downwind of their cities. Tens of thousands of these snails had to be harvested, their shells crushed, and the glands left to rot in salt water, slowly fermenting under the sun until the precious color emerged. The resulting dye was worth more than its weight in gold, a substance so costly that only royalty, high priests, and the wealthiest aristocrats could afford it. To wear a garment of Tyrian purple was to make a statement of supreme status, and the Phoenicians held a jealous monopoly on its creation. This single product, born of a snail and a closely guarded chemical process, funded their fleets and gave them access to the courts of kings across the known world. With the wealth from wood and dye, the Phoenicians became the consummate middlemen, the ocean-going carriers for every other civilization. Their ships, the Gaulois or round ships for cargo, were deep-bellied and powered by a single, large square sail, capable of carrying the heavy ingots of copper from Cyprus or tin from the far-off lands of Anatolia. They also developed advanced warships, the Baireme, to protect their precious cargoes from the pirates who prowled the rocky inlets of the Aegean. They traded Egyptian linens, Mesopotamian textiles, like those we saw from Sumer, Aegean olive oil, and wine from their own terraced hillsides. They were masters of glassmaking, another art they learned from Egypt and Mesopotamia, refining it to create delicate, colorful glass vessels and beads that became a trade staple. But their true genius lay not just in moving goods, but in seeking new sources of the raw materials the civilized world craved, particularly metals. This insatiable demand for metal, especially the silver and tin needed for bronze and currency, pushed the Phoenician sailors beyond the familiar horizons of the eastern Mediterranean. They sailed past Crete, past Sicily, past the coast of Italy, braving open waters that others feared. Their oral navigational charts, passed from father to son, used the fixed point of the North Star, which the Greeks would come to call the Phoenician Star, to sail at night, a feat of remarkable skill. They established a chain of small, fortified trading posts along the coast of North Africa, on the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, and most importantly, on the southern coast of Spain. Here, in the land they called Tarshish, they found what they were seeking, a seemingly inexhaustible source of silver, iron, and tin. This westward expansion, driven purely by commercial ambition, culminated in the founding of their greatest colony, Carthage, around 814 BCE, a city that would one day grow to rival Rome itself. In the course of these vast, repetitive, and complex transactions, the Phoenicians gave the world their most enduring innovation, one born entirely of mercantile necessity. The cuneiform of Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphs of Egypt were complex, beautiful scripts, but they required years of dedicated study, suitable for priests and scribes, but hopelessly clumsy for a busy sea captain trying to log a cargo of wine or a merchant needing a quick, simple contract in a foreign port. The Phoenicians developed a radical solution, a simplified system of just 22 abstract symbols where each sign represented a single consonant sound. This was the first true alphabet, a phonetic script so simple, so elegant, so flexible that an ordinary person could learn it in weeks. They spread this tool as they spread their goods, and it was eagerly adopted by their trading partners, including the Greeks, who added vowels and passed it to the Romans, who in turn gave it to us. This extraordinary intellectual leap, the foundation of Western literacy, was not the product of a king or a philosopher, but the practical invention of a pragmatic, seafaring people who simply needed a better way to keep their accounts. Their web of trade, woven from purple snails and cedar trees, had accidentally captured the very sound of human speech, and in doing so, had bound the future together. The Phoenicians had woven their web across the water, a network of ports and colonies bound by the sea, but on the land, a new kind of power was mastering a different kind of distance. This was the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, the largest empire the world had yet seen, a colossal state that by 500 BCE stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. This vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual territory presented an unprecedented administrative challenge. How does a single ruler in a central capital like Susa or Persepolis maintain control over territories that are months of travel away? The answer came from the visionary King Darius the Great, a ruler who understood that an empire is held together not just by armies, but by infrastructure, by the speed at which a command can travel, and the safety with which a merchant can move. His solution was a marvel of engineering and political will, the Royal Road. This was not a meandering collection of footpaths like the Amber Road, but a deliberately constructed and maintained imperial highway, the central nervous system of Persian power. The most famous and complete section of this road system stretched for an astonishing 1,677 miles, connecting Darius's administrative capital at Susa in the lowlands of modern-day Iran to the crucial city of Sardis in western Anatolia, the former capital of the Lydian kingdom, and the empire's wealthy, rebellious gateway to the Greek world. This road was a physical manifestation of the king's authority, an artery designed primarily for the state. Its purpose was communication and control, allowing the King of Kings to dispatch orders, receive intelligence from his provincial governors, the satraps, and move his armies with terrifying speed to any corner of the realm that dared to challenge his rule. The true genius of the road lay in its relentless efficiency, a system that astounded the Greek historian Herodotus, who observed it in action. Darius established a series of 111 postal stations, or chebarchanae, positioned at regular intervals along the route, each roughly a day's hard ride from the next. These were not mere resting places. They were permanent, state-funded relay posts, staffed and equipped with fresh, powerful horses and official messengers, the Piradasish, who were ready to ride at a moment's notice in any weather. When a royal courier carrying the king's message arrived at a station, his leather satchel was immediately handed to a fresh rider, who would leap onto a waiting horse and gallop off to the next post. This system, a sort of pony express of the ancient world, operated 24 hours a day. It was said that nothing mortal moved faster, that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night could stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. A message that would take a normal traveler, or even a marching army, a full 3 months to carry from Susa to Sardis, could now be delivered in as little as 7 to 9 days. This unprecedented speed transformed the art of governance, effectively shrinking the vast empire. But this state-sponsored artery inevitably became a vital channel for commerce. The same features that made it perfect for messengers made it ideal for merchants. The road was wide, well-maintained, and crucially, it was safe. Persian soldiers patrolled its length, guarding the cisterns that provided water in dry stretches and garrisoning the checkpoints that controlled passage. For a merchant organizing a caravan, this state-guaranteed security was a revolutionary development. It meant that a train of donkeys or camels loaded with valuable goods could travel from the Aegean to the heart of Persia with a reasonable expectation of arriving unmolested by bandits. The royal stations, while officially for state use, also provided secure places to rest, caravanserai, where merchants could water their animals and trade news in the relative safety of a fortified courtyard. Thus, the royal road became the empire's primary economic conduit, a two-way flow of wealth. Westward, from the Persian heartland, traveled textiles, spices, and the administrative orders that bound the empire together. But the eastward flow, toward the capitals of Susa and Persepolis, was a river of tribute and trade from the conquered provinces. From Sardis came the gold and silver of Anatolia, including the Lydian invention of coinage, which Darius would soon adopt and standardize across the empire. From the north came copper and iron, from the south, Egyptian grain and ivory, and from the distant eastern provinces, the same lapis lazuli from Afghanistan that we saw in the tombs of Ur, now traveling a faster, more organized path. Darius further fueled this commerce by introducing one of the first standardized imperial currencies, the gold daric and the silver siglos, coins stamped with the image of the king as an archer, their purity and weight guaranteed by his authority. A merchant in Sardis now knew precisely what his money was worth in Susa, removing the friction of barter. This road was more than stone and dust. It was a system of communication, security, and standardized value, the terrestrial backbone of the first great world empire, and it was already pointing the way toward an even more ambitious route, one that would soon connect this entire system to the enigmatic Silken Empire rising in the Far East. The great Persian royal road had drawn a line of order and speed across the known world of the West, terminating at the shores of the Aegean Sea, a frontier brimming with the ambitious, fractious cultures of Greece. But beyond the Persian Empire's easternmost provinces, beyond the Indus, lay a vastness that was the subject only of myth and conjecture, a world separated by the immense barriers of the Pamir and Himalayan mountains and the chilling, endless expanse of the Eurasian steppe. As the Persian Empire was falling to Alexander, and as his successors were, in turn, giving way to the new power of Rome, another equally potent empire was consolidating its power in the Far East. This was the Han Dynasty of China, a realm of profound learning, meticulous bureaucracy, and immense wealth. Yet it was an empire that believed itself to be the entirety of the civilized world, the Middle Kingdom, surrounded on all sides as by less developed barbarian peoples. Its greatest and most persistent threat came from the north, from the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic horse lords who dominated the steppe, extorting tribute and launching devastating raids deep into Chinese territory. The Han were cut off. The Xiongnu controlled the crucial Gansu corridor, the only viable passage from China to the west, and their equestrian dominance made them a terrifyingly effective military force against the slower, infantry-based Han armies. The seventh Han emperor, the ambitious and energetic Emperor Wu, who ascended the throne in 141 BCE, grew tired of this constant threat and the humiliating policy of appeasement. He conceived a bold, almost desperate diplomatic gambit. He had heard that a people known as the Yuezhi, who had once lived to China's northwest, had been brutally defeated by the Xiongnu and had fled far to the west. His plan was to find these displaced Yuezhi, wherever they might be, and forge a grand military alliance, convincing them to join the Han in a massive pincer movement against their common Xiongnu enemy. For this mission, a quest into the absolute unknown, he needed a man of extraordinary courage, resourcefulness, and loyalty. He chose a minor court official named Zhang Qian. Around 138 BCE, Zhang Qian set out from the Han capital of Chang'an with a delegation of about 100 men, including a Xiongnu guide who had defected. His mission was purely diplomatic and military. Trade was not even a consideration. He carried with him the imperial yak-tail standard, the symbol of his authority as the emperor's envoy, and stepped out beyond the Great Wall, almost immediately vanishing into the hostile territory of the Xiongnu. He was captured within days. The Xiongnu leader, the Chanyu, held Zhang Qian in a state of relatively comfortable captivity for 10 long years, attempting to break his will and absorb him into their culture. They gave him a Xiongnu wife, with whom he had a son, and he was forced to live the life of a nomad, riding with them, hunting, and learning their ways. But through this entire decade, Zhang Qian never forgot his mission. He kept his imperial standard close, a tattered, fading symbol of his loyalty, waiting for the one moment, the one lapse in vigilance that would allow him to continue his journey. That moment finally came. After 10 years, he and his most loyal aide escaped, resuming their westward quest. They traveled on, following fragmented rumors of the Yuezhi's path, entering a world that no Chinese person had ever seen and returned to describe. They passed through the Jade Gate, the westernmost outpost of Chinese influence, and entered the terrifying void of the Taklamakan Desert, a place whose Uyghur name is often translated as, "You go in, but you never come out." They navigated this wasteland by skirting its southern rim, moving between the small, isolated oasis kingdoms that clung to the life-giving streams flowing from the Kunlun Mountains. After crossing this desert, they faced an even more formidable barrier: the snow-choked, breathless passes of the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world. They were now profoundly, unimaginably far from home. On the other side of the mountains, Zhang Qian descended into the Fergana Valley in what is today Uzbekistan. He was astonished by what he found. Here were not the nomadic barbarians he expected, but sophisticated, high-nosed, often red-bearded people living in walled cities, growing grapes to make wine, and most astoundingly, breeding a race of horses unlike anything he had ever seen. These were the Tianma, the heavenly horses, or celestial steeds, large, powerful, and fast, sweating blood, a phenomenon now believed to be caused by a parasitic nematode, and they were the mounts of a powerful cavalry. He continued south, eventually locating the Yuezhi in Bactria, ancient Afghanistan. He found them settled, rich from agriculture and trade, and content in their new land. They had grown soft, and they had absolutely no desire to risk their new prosperity by traveling back across a continent to seek revenge on their old Xiongnu enemies. Zhang Qian's diplomatic mission, the entire purpose of his journey, was a complete and total failure. He began the long, heartbreaking journey home, his mission unfulfilled. He attempted a different route, this time around the north of the Taklamakan, only to be captured by the Xiongnu again. He was held for another year before a civil war among the Xiongnu allowed him to escape in the chaos, grabbing his wife, his son, and his loyal aide. In 125 BCE, 13 years after he had departed, Zhang Qian finally stumbled back into Chang'an, a man presumed long dead. Of the 100 who had set out, only he and his aide remained. He presented himself to Emperor Wu, a failure in his assigned task. But he brought back something infinitely more valuable than a military alliance. He brought back knowledge. He delivered a detailed report of the powerful urbanized civilizations of Central Asia, of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Fergana. He described their wealth, their products, and their desire for Chinese goods. He reported, in a detail that electrified the court, that he had seen Chinese bamboo and silk cloth in the markets of Bactria, and had learned they arrived there not from the east, but by a long, circuitous route from the south through a land called Shendu, India. This proved that China was not an isolated island. The world was connected, and another empire, perhaps as great as the Han, lay at the end of a long westward path. This report, and the burning desire for the heavenly horses of Fergana to build a cavalry that could finally defeat the Xiongnu, changed Chinese foreign policy forever. Emperor Wu began sending new missions, this time not just diplomatic, but commercial and military, to secure the Fergana horses and open a trade route to these new Western markets. The primary commodity that these new merchants carried, the one thing the West had never seen and instantly coveted, was a closely guarded Chinese secret: silk. This shimmering, lightweight, and incredibly strong fiber, spun by the Bombyx mori silkworm, became the currency that unlocked the West. The path that Zhang Qian had blazed, the dangerous chain of deserts, mountains, and oases, became the conduit for this new exchange. It was not a single, paved highway like the Persian Royal Road, but a complex, fragile, and vital network of routes that for the first time in history would directly connect the empires of China and Rome. Zhang Qian, the loyal, failed diplomat, had accidentally become the father of the Silk Road, and as its caravans began to flow west, another older empire in the Mediterranean was simultaneously perfecting a trade network of its own, one built not on land, but on the blue waters of its very own sea. As Zhang Qian's mission was cracking open the far eastern end of the world, the Mediterranean Sea had, for the first time in its long history, fallen under the complete and total domination of a single power. The fragmented, competitive sea lanes of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Carthaginians had been consolidated, pacified, and absorbed by the relentless expansion of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire. The Romans, a people originally of the land, of soldiers and farmers, had learned to master the sea through brutal necessity, first in their existential wars against Carthage, and later in their campaigns to subjugate the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. By the reign of Augustus, the sea that had once been a barrier of competing interests was now an internal Roman lake, the great blue heart of their civilization. They called it, with a possessive, confident, and entirely accurate term, Mare Nostrum, our sea. And this sea was not a route for exploration or a mere conduit for luxuries. It was the empire's essential, non-negotiable lifeline, a vast, watery conveyor belt dedicated to a single, overriding purpose, feeding the colossal, insatiable city of Rome itself. The engine of this entire maritime network was the Cura Annani, the grain supply. Rome was a metropolis unlike anything the world had ever seen, a sprawling, marble-clad city that at its height held 1 million souls. This teeming population, with its legions of poor, its vast public works, and its restless plebeian class, could not be fed by the farms of Italy alone. The stability of the empire, the very authority of the emperor, depended on the panem et circense, the bread and games, and that bread came by ship. This was not a private enterprise left to chance. It was a state-run, state-subsidized, and state-protected logistical operation of staggering scale. The two great breadbaskets of the empire were North Africa, with its ancient, fertile Carthaginian heartland, and, most importantly, the unimaginably rich, black soil of Egypt, which Augustus had claimed as his personal domain after the defeat of Cleopatra. The annual Nile flood produced a grain surplus so vast it was seen as a divine guarantee of the empire's survival. From the great port of Alexandria, the second city of the empire, a specialized fleet of massive merchant ships, the Corbetae, would set sail each year after the harvest. These were not the sleek, oared galleys of war, but deep-bellied, round-hulled sailing vessels, some reaching 180 feet in length, capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of wheat. They were the supertankers of the ancient world. Their journey was perilous, relying entirely on the summer sailing season's prevailing winds. They would beat their way west, often stopping in Crete or Sicily, before making the final run up the western coast of Italy to the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. An entire city lived in dread of the news that this fleet had been delayed by storms, or in earlier days, by pirates. The Emperor Claudius, understanding this vulnerability, constructed an immense artificial deep-water harbor just north of Ostia, which he called Portus, a feat of engineering designed solely to receive these vital shipments safely and efficiently. Upon arrival, the grain was transferred to smaller river barges, moved up the Tiber, and stored in the vast Horia, the state granaries of the capital, ready to be milled into flour and distributed often for free to the Roman populace. While grain was the strategic foundation, two other liquids flowed in almost equal abundance, forming the trinity of the Mediterranean diet: wine and olive oil. The Roman love for wine was legendary, and Italian vintages, particularly from Campania, were initially the most prized, exported in vast quantities across the empire. The evidence for this trade is not written in texts, but piled in a man-made hill. In Rome, near the Tiber, stands Monte Testaccio, a grassy mound over 100 feet high and nearly a mile in circumference. It is not a natural hill. It is a meticulously stacked, ancient landfill composed entirely of the broken shards of an estimated 53 million amphorae, the large clay jars used for transport. The vast majority of these discarded jars were not for wine, but for the empire's other essential liquid, olive oil. Olive oil was central to Roman life, used not just for cooking, but as the primary fuel for lamps that lit the empire's nights, and, critically, as the soap of the ancient world, slathered on the body and scraped clean in the public baths. Archaeological analysis of the amphorae at Monte Testaccio reveals a fascinating shift in the imperial economy. The earliest layers are filled with jars from Italy, but as time went on, the sourcing changed. The overwhelming majority of the hill is composed of Dressel 20 amphorae, a distinctive globular type that came from one specific, distant province, Baetica, in southern Spain. This region had become the empire's specialized olive grove, its hillsides dedicated to producing a river of oil that flowed exclusively to the capital. Later, as Baetica's production waned, the trade shifted to the high-quality oils of North Africa. Each amphora was stamped, marked with its origin, its producer, and its weight, a level of quality control and bureaucratic tracking that the Harappans, with their small seals, would have admired. This hill of broken pottery is a silent, monumental ledger, a physical graph of the imperial economy, demonstrating the interconnectedness and profound specialization that Roman peace had brought to Mare Nostrum. This entire system, grain from Egypt, oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, lead from Britain, was made possible by one crucial Roman achievement: security. Pompey the Great's famous campaign in 67 BCE, which cleared the entire Mediterranean of the powerful Cilician pirates in just 3 months, was the act that truly created our sea, turning a dangerous frontier into a secure, patrolled, and predictable highway for commerce, a liquid superhighway ready to receive the silken luxuries now trickling in from the desert routes to the east. The vast, secure, and hungry Roman lake, Mare Nostrum, had created a consolidated market of unprecedented wealth, and with that wealth came an insatiable appetite for the exotic, the rare, and the sacred. While the state obsessed over the practicalities of grain and oil, the temples, aristocrats, and even the middling classes of the empire developed a profound craving for the fragrances of the East. This was not a mere desire for perfume, it was a spiritual necessity. The very air of Roman religion, its public ceremonies, and its private rites was thick with the scent of burning incense, a practice they had inherited and amplified from the Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians. The gods, it was believed, were honored and nourished by the fragrant smoke, and in a city as vast as Rome, the demand was nearly industrial. This sacred hunger gave rise to one of the most arduous, valuable, and mysterious trade routes of the ancient world, the incense route, a path that brought the tears of the gods from a secret corner of the world to the altars of the Roman pantheon. The source of this sacred smoke was a tiny, remote, and forbidding region, confined to the misty, monsoon-swept coastal mountains of southern Arabia, what is today Yemen and Oman, and the nearby island of Socotra. This was the Arabia Felix of the Roman geographers, Fortunate Arabia, a name it earned not for its lushness, which was minimal, but for its exclusive monopoly on the two most precious resins in the world. Here, and only here, grew the gnarled, thorny, and unassuming trees that produced this wealth: the Boswellia sacra, which yielded frankincense, and the Commiphora myrrha, which produced myrrh. Frankincense, harvested by slashing the bark and collecting the milky white beads of resin, or tears that bled out and hardened, was the scent of divinity. Its sweet, ethereal smoke used to consecrate temples and honor the gods. Myrrh, a darker reddish-brown and bitter resin, was a substance of the earth, a powerful antiseptic, an analgesic, a key ingredient in perfumes and cosmetics, and, most famously, an essential component in the sacred rites of embalming and burial, a fragrance to honor and preserve the dead. The kingdoms of southern Arabia, most notably the Sabaeans, the biblical kingdom of Sheba, grew fabulously, almost mythically, wealthy by guarding this monopoly. Their capital at Marib was an oasis of legendary sophistication, its prosperity watered by the Great Marib Dam, an engineering marvel that turned the desert fringe into a garden. These kingdoms actively cultivated the source of their wealth, creating elaborate stories to frighten away any potential competitors. Herodotus wrote, with perfect credulity, that the frankincense trees were guarded by small, winged serpents of many colors, which had to be driven away with the smoke of styrax resin before the harvest could be gathered. This propaganda, a masterful act of market control, ensured that the Sabaeans and their neighbors remained the exclusive suppliers, the gatekeepers to the sacred. They became the first link in a long and perilous chain, a chain that would have to cross one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth. The only way to move this precious, lightweight cargo from the southern coast to the Mediterranean markets, over 2,000 miles away, was by land, on the back of the one animal that could endure such a journey, the dromedary camel. This ship of the desert, domesticated centuries earlier, was the technological key. Great caravans, sometimes numbering thousands of camels, were assembled, each animal laden with sacks of the fragrant resin. They began a slow, swaying, and terrifying trek, moving north along the western edge of the great Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, a sea of sand larger than France. Their path was not a road, but a chain of vital, fortified oases, each a small pinprick of green, and life in a wasteland of sun-scorched rock and shifting dunes. Each oasis, Shabwa, Najran, Mecca, Yathrib, later Medina, was a necessary stop for water, food, and rest, and each was a toll station. The local tribes who controlled these wells extracted their share of the wealth, and the price of the incense grew with every mile it traveled north. After months of navigating this perilous, bandit-haunted corridor, the caravan would reach the northern terminus of the Arabian route, which for a crucial period was the astonishing city of Petra. Here, the Nabateans, a brilliant Arab trading kingdom, had carved a magnificent metropolis from the red sandstone cliffs. Petra was the perfect terminus and toll booth, a secret, rock-walled fortress where the incense route converged with other routes from the east. The Nabateans, master hydrologists and merchants, acted as the final middlemen, transferring the frankincense and myrrh to Roman merchants, who would then carry it the last few miles to the port of Gaza on the Mediterranean. From Gaza, the resin was loaded onto the same Roman merchant ships that carried Egyptian grain, joining the maritime superhighway of Mare Nostrum and finally arriving at the port of Ostia to be transported to the Horia Piperitaria, the spice and incense warehouses of Rome. The sheer volume of this trade and its cost staggered Roman commentators. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, complained bitterly that the empire was being drained of its gold and silver to pay for these luxuries for men and even for their dead. He calculated that at least 100 million sesterces flowed out of the empire every year to Arabia, India, and China, a catastrophic trade imbalance for what he saw as ephemeral smoke and baubles. He noted that the lowest grade of frankincense sold for 6 denarii a pound, while the purest, whitest resin was worth its weight in gold. The demand was so extreme that when the wife of Emperor Nero, Poppaea, died in 65 CE, it was said that Nero burned more than a year's entire harvest of Arabian incense at her funeral, a display of piety and extravagance that consumed a fortune in a single, fragrant cloud. This root, built on a sacred scent, had connected the altars of Rome to the thorny trees of Yemen, turning desert sheikhs into kings and carving cities from rock. And as these caravans plodded their patient way across the sand, a revolutionary new understanding of the winds was about to open a path across the sea, a path that would bypass the desert and connect Rome directly to the true source of the tears of the gods and the even greater treasures that lay beyond. The caravans of the incense route, plodding their slow and patient way across the sands of Arabia, were a testament to human endurance, but they were also a profound logistical bottleneck. This land route was excruciatingly slow, dangerously exposed to desert raiders, and burdened by the endless tolls of every sheikh whose well and oasis the merchants depended upon. The Roman historian Pliny's complaint about the river of gold flowing east was a direct result of this inefficiency. The frankincense and myrrh that arrived in Rome had passed through so many hands, each adding their price, that its final cost was truly astronomical. For centuries, the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, which lay just beyond the shores of Arabia Felix, was seen as a barrier, an unpredictable, terrifying void. Sailors, like those of the Phoenicians, practiced cautious cabotage, hugging the coastline, crawling from port to port, their sails always within reassuring sight of land. But all along this ocean, from the coast of East Africa to the Malabar coast of India, sailors felt the rhythm of an immense planetary breath, the monsoon. For half the year, from roughly April to September, the intense summer heat building over the vast Asian landmass creates a low-pressure system that pulls in cool, moisture-laden air from the sea, resulting in the powerful, wet, southwest monsoon that blows reliably from Africa towards India. Then, for the other half of the year, as the continent cools in winter, the dynamic reverses. A high-pressure system builds over the land, and the winds switch direction, blowing with cool, dry, steady force from the northeast, from India back towards Africa and Arabia. This was the ocean's great secret, a seasonal, predictable, and incredibly powerful wind engine. The Arab, Persian, and Indian sailors who lived on these shores had known this secret for centuries, using it for their own regional trade. But they guarded this knowledge as jealously as the Sabaeans guarded their incense trees. It was this secret that, once unlocked by the wider world, would shatter the land-based monopolies and revolutionize global trade. The Romans, based in their newly conquered province of Egypt, were perfectly positioned at the Red Sea, the gateway to this eastern ocean, and they were desperate to bypass the Arabian land route. The traditional story, perhaps a simplification of a gradual diffusion of knowledge, attributes the discovery to a single, bold Greek navigator in the service of Rome, a man named Hippolus, around 100 BCE. Whether Hippolus was a real person or a myth, the knowledge he represents was real. He, or sailors like him, learned that they did not have to crawl for months around the coast. A ship could leave an Egyptian port on the Red Sea, like Myos Hormos, sail south to the mouth of the Red Sea, and then, catching the summer monsoon, point its bow directly into the open, unknown expanse of the Arabian Sea. For 40 days, they would be out of sight of land, a terrifying prospect for an ancient mariner, trusting their lives entirely to this single, roaring wind, which the Arabs called mausim, our monsoon. This act of faith, this harnessing of the wind, was a commercial revolution, a journey that had taken many months of coastal sailing, with all its attendant risks of pirates and shipwreck on hidden reefs, was now reduced to a direct, non-stop voyage of just over a month. The Roman-Egyptian fleets, often numbering over 100 ships a year, would depart in midsummer, arriving on the rich Malabar coast of southern India at bustling, multi-ethnic port cities like Muziris and Arikamedu. The Roman merchants came laden with the products of the Mediterranean, fine Italian wines in their amphorae, delicate glassware, statues, textiles, and above all, a currency that the entire world trusted, Roman gold and silver coins, the aurae and denarii. They would spend the autumn and early winter in these vibrant Indian ports, trading their western goods for the treasures of the East. And what treasures they were! They were not primarily seeking frankincense, which they could now get more cheaply, but a commodity that grew only in this part of the world and was craved by Roman palates, piper nigrum, black pepper. This simple dried peppercorn was the ultimate prize, so valuable in Rome that it was sometimes used to pay taxes or ransoms, sold literally by the kernel. Along with pepper, the ships were loaded with fine Indian cottons, shimmering silks that had trickled in from China, translucent pearls from the coast of Sri Lanka, precious stones like beryls and sapphires, and ivory. The merchants would then wait patiently until December or January, when the planetary engine shifted gear. The reliable northeast monsoon would begin to blow, and they would set sail once more, their hulls now low in the water, heavy with the wealth of India, pushed by a gentle, steady wind that carried them directly back across the ocean to the Red Sea, their journey home just as predictable as their journey out. The evidence for this astonishing maritime route is not just in texts, though we have a remarkable one. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek-language sailor's guide from the 1st century CE, details this entire network, listing the ports of call, the travel times, the goods to trade, and the nature of the winds with the practical precision of a modern almanac. The physical proof is even more compelling. Archaeologists in southern India have unearthed vast hoards of Roman coins, tens of thousands of them, buried for safekeeping by the Indian merchants who had grown rich on this trade. This is the very gold that Pliny the Elder lamented, a physical testament to the massive trade imbalance. This mastery of the monsoon had for the first time connected the two great centers of classical civilization, Rome and India, in a direct, high-speed, and high-volume exchange, turning the Indian Ocean from a barrier into a superhighway. And this new connection was already sending ripples of wealth deep into the heart of another continent, where a different kind of ocean, an ocean of sand, was waiting for its own ships to set sail. While the Roman Greek sailors were harnessing the great wind engine of the monsoon, turning the Indian Ocean into a predictable, watery highway, another, even more formidable ocean was being conquered by that same patient, resilient technology, the dromedary camel. This was the Sahara, the Bahar Belama, the river without water, an expanse of rock, gravel, and shifting dunes stretching across the entire breadth of North Africa, a barrier of crushing heat and profound silence that separated the Mediterranean world from the mysteries of the lands to the south. For millennia, this desert had been an almost absolute divide, a place of death for any who dared to cross it. But the slow, westward spread of the domesticated camel, the ship of the desert we first met on the incense route, had finally provided the key. This animal, with its ability to endure weeks without water and to metabolize its own hump of fat for sustenance, transformed the Sahara from an impassable void into a treacherous but ultimately navigable sea of sand. This new route, the Trans-Saharan, was not born of a desire for exotic luxuries or sacred smoke, but from one of the most fundamental and desperate biological needs of humankind. The Mediterranean North, connected to the Roman and later Arab worlds, had access to manufactured goods, fine textiles, metalwork, and above all, a substance it possessed in abundance: salt. This salt was evaporated in coastal pans, or more importantly, mined in vast crystallized deposits from the desert itself, in desolate locations like Tagaza, a remote mining post in the deep desert where the very houses were said to be built from blocks of gray, gritty salt. To the merchants of the north, salt was a common, heavy commodity. But to the south, in the humid, tropical lands of West Africa, in the fertile river basins of the Niger and the Senegal, salt was life itself. In a climate where the human body loses essential electrolytes with every bead of sweat, salt was a biological necessity, more precious than any jewel, and it was agonizingly scarce. From this desperate need, a profound and symbiotic exchange was born, an equation that would build empires. The peoples of the West African forests and savanna, particularly in the regions of Bambouk and Bure, had access to a substance the North craved with an almost mythical hunger: gold. They lived atop some of the richest alluvial gold fields on Earth, where the precious metal could be sifted from riverbeds and dug from shallow mines. This gold was so plentiful that their rulers would adorn themselves in it, weaving it into their hair and wearing it as solid chains, yet they lacked the one mineral their bodies required to survive. This imbalance created the central, driving force of the trans-Saharan trade, a pound of salt for a pound of gold. It was a barter of perceived equals. The mundane traded for the magnificent, a block of life-preserving sodium chloride for a nugget of gleaming, incorruptible metal. The masters of this new and perilous ocean were the nomadic Berber and Tuareg peoples, the veiled blue men of the desert, who alone knew the secrets of this vast and featureless land. They were the navigators, the captains of the camel caravans, their lives organized around the knowledge of hidden oases, the faint tracks in the gravel plains, and the movements of the stars, which guided them through the long, cold desert nights. They organized the great azalai, the salt caravans, which might consist of thousands of camels, each laden with heavy slabs of salt, setting out from northern entrepôts like Sijil Masa on a journey that could last 2 months. They braved the blinding sandstorms, the withering heat, and the constant threat of attack from rival clans, moving from one precious, life-giving well to the next, their swaying progress a thin, fragile line of life drawn across an ocean of emptiness. These caravans did not travel all the way to the gold fields themselves, which were often hidden deep in the forest, their locations a jealously guarded secret of the southern peoples. Instead, the trade route terminated on the southern shore of the desert, in the region known as the Sahel, a band of semi-arid grassland. Here, great market cities rose from the dust, cities like Kumbi Salek, Gao, and later the legendary Timbuktu. These cities became the meeting points, the docks of the Sand Sea. It was here that the great empires of West Africa were born. The first of these, the Ghana Empire, became fabulously wealthy not by mining gold. They did not control the mines, but by controlling the trade. The kings of Ghana, the lords of the gold, established a secure terminus for the caravans and imposed a heavy, systematic tax on every single slab of salt that entered their kingdom from the north, and on every single ounce of gold that left it from the south. This royal control, this brokerage of a vital exchange, funded their armies, their courts, and their legendary gold-draped power. Arab geographers who later visited these kingdoms, like al-Masudi and al-Bakri, wrote in awe of the wealth they witnessed, describing the king of Ghana holding court, adorned in golden jewelry, surrounded by guards with gold-handled swords. It was this trade that brought Islam south across the desert, carried by the merchants and along with their salt, gradually and peacefully transforming the religious and cultural landscape of the Sahel. And it was this trade that for the first time connected sub-Saharan Africa into the great circulatory system of the medieval world. The gold of West Africa, traded for the salt of the desert, flowed north into the Maghreb, where it was minted by Arab caliphates, and from there it crossed the Mediterranean into Europe, providing the very bullion that would centuries later help fuel the economic rebirth of the Renaissance. This ocean of sand, once a silent barrier, had become a golden river, and on its distant northern shore, a different kind of commerce, driven by furs and cold rivers, was simultaneously weaving another, darker web of connection. While the camel caravans of the Sahara were patiently weaving their golden thread across the southern desert, another, far more aggressive network was being carved across the cold, wet heartland of the north. In the mists of Scandinavia, a people were emerging whose very name would become synonymous with terror and exploration, the Norse or Vikings. We often picture them as coastal raiders, their iconic longships appearing like dragons from the sea to plunder the monasteries of Britain and France, a terrifying force of chaos unleashed upon a settled Christian Europe. But this was only one half of their story, the half told by their Western victims. There was another, Eastern-facing branch of this Norse expansion, a movement driven less by plunder and more by a relentless, entrepreneurial search for new trade routes, a search that would lead them down the great winding river systems of Eastern Europe on an epic journey to the richest cities on Earth. Their story begins not with open ocean, but with dense forests and a maze of interconnected rivers, lakes, and portages. These were the Rus, a name believed to derive from an Old Norse term for the men who row, and they came primarily from the lands of modern-day Sweden. They looked east, not west, and saw the vast forested wilderness of what would become Russia as a boundless territory of opportunity, a river road waiting to be mastered. Their vessel was not the deep-keeled oceanic longship, but a lighter, shallower draft nar or skuta, a versatile ship that could be both sailed on open lakes and, crucially, rowed upriver against a current. Even more importantly, their ships were light enough to be portaged, emptied of their cargo, hauled out of the water, and physically dragged or rolled on logs over the land, from the headwaters of one river system, across a watershed, and into the headwaters of another. This single, grueling technique was their key to unlocking a continent, allowing them to stitch together a continuous path from the cold Baltic to the warm southern seas. They established two primary routes, two liquid highways. The first, and most direct, was the Dnieper route. This path took them from their trading posts on the Baltic, like Birka, into the Gulf of Finland. They would sail up the short, swift Neva River into the vast, stormy expanse of Lake Ladoga, where they founded a vital outpost, Staraya Ladoga, the first seed of the future Russian state. From there, they rowed south up the Volkhov River, past the future site of Novgorod, and then began the arduous portages, dragging their ships over muddy hills to reach the upper streams of the Dnieper River. This great river then became their highway, a long flowing artery that carried them south, through the dense forests, past the rapids, and across the open steppe, a vast sea of grass controlled by hostile nomadic horsemen like the Pechenegs. After a journey of hundreds of miles, the Dnieper finally emptied into the Black Sea, and a short coastal sail brought them to their ultimate destination. Miklagard, the great city, the Norse name for Constantinople, the glittering, golden, and impossibly wealthy capital of the Byzantine Empire. The other great route was the Volga route, a path that led not to the Christian Empire, but to the silver-rich caliphates of the Islamic world. This route also began in the Baltic, but diverged, taking the Rus south down the Volga River, the great spine of Russia. This long, meandering path led them through the lands of the Khazars, a powerful Turkic kingdom that had converted to Judaism and controlled the lower Volga, acting as a crucial intermediary. The Volga emptied not into the Black Sea, but into the Caspian Sea, a vast inland ocean. From here, the Rus could sail to its southern shores, to the markets of Persia and the Arab lands, or meet Arab and Persian merchants who traveled north to the Khazar capital of Itil. This route was defined by a single commodity that the Abbasid Caliphate, with its sophisticated coin-based economy, possessed in almost limitless quantities: silver, Arab dirhams, minted in cities like Samarkand and Baghdad, flowed north in a torrent, becoming the dominant currency of the Viking Age. What did the Rus bring south on these perilous, month-long journeys to justify such rewards? They brought the raw, harsh treasures of the deep north. First they brought gray gold, furs. The cold, dark, unending forests of the north were home to sable, marten, ermine, and fox, animals whose pelts were the ultimate luxury in the refined courts of Byzantium and Baghdad, a symbol of status and warmth. They also brought honey and beeswax and walrus ivory from the Arctic, but their other great and far darker commodity was human. These Eastern Vikings were the greatest slave traders of the age. The very word slave in English derives from the name of the people they preyed upon, the Slavs, the forest-dwelling tribes who lived along these river routes. The Rus would raid Slavic villages, capturing men, women, and children, or they would purchase them from local chieftains, binding them and loading them into their ships alongside the bales of fur. These captives were then sold in the great slave markets of Constantinople or the Islamic world, a tragic human cost for the silver that flowed north. The evidence for this vast network is overwhelming. Byzantine chroniclers, like Emperor Constantine VII, described the Rus in detail, noting their annual arrival at Constantinople in their flotillas of dugout canoes and the complex trade agreements made with these fierce, red-bearded northerners. But the most powerful evidence comes from the earth itself. Tens of thousands of Islamic silver dirhams and Byzantine milliarizia coins have been found buried in Viking Age hoards all across Scandinavia, particularly on the island of Gotland, a major Baltic trading hub. These hoards are the physical, tangible profit of those long river journeys, silver earned in Baghdad and used to buy a farm in Sweden. This riverine network had done something extraordinary. It had connected the Arctic fur trapper to the Byzantine emperor and the Arab caliph, creating a vertical north-south axis of trade that cut directly through the heart of Europe. And in the great bazaars of Constantinople, these Rus merchants, smelling of pine, fur, and sweat, would have brushed shoulders with another group of traders, the true masters of the overland route from the east, who were bringing in the most precious commodity of all. In the great vaulted bazaars of Constantinople, where the Rus Vikings, smelling of fur and river water, came to trade their northern wares, they would have brushed past men of a very different character. These were not warriors who traded. They were traders who had mastered a different, drier, and far older ocean. They were the Sogdians, the true unsung masters of the Silk Road, the professional middlemen who for centuries formed the connective tissue holding the Eurasian continent together. While empires rose and fell, the Han, the Persians, the Romans, the Gökturks, the Tang, the Sogdians endured, their focus not on conquest, but on the caravan, the contract, and the quiet, persistent accumulation of profit. They were the ultimate merchants, a people who defined themselves not by a single, contiguous empire, but by a vast, sprawling network of trust that stretched from the heart of China to the shores of the Black Sea. Their homeland, Sogdiana, was a small but fertile pocket of civilization in Central Asia, a land of oasis cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjakent, watered by the Zarafshan River, a name that means the sprinkler of gold. This location was their destiny. They were perfectly precariously positioned in the exact bottleneck of the ancient world. To their east lay the Chinese empires, jealous guardians of silk. To their south lay the riches of India. To their west lay the markets of Persia and the Byzantine Empire. And to their north, dominating the endless steppe, were the powerful, nomadic Turkic Khaganates, who controlled the grasslands and the supplies of horses, furs, and slaves. The Sogdians were surrounded, yet they turned this vulnerability into their greatest strength. They became the indispensable intermediaries for everyone, the master diplomats and linguists who could speak the languages of all four worlds, the one people trusted to move value across these dangerous cultural and political frontiers. A Sogdian merchant's life was one of almost constant motion, a life lived on the road. They did not just travel the Silk Road, they inhabited it. Their genius was in establishing a diaspora, a chain of small, tight-knit Sogdian communities in every major oasis town and imperial capital along the route. A Sogdian caravan leader, leaving his magnificent home in Samarkand, would not be journeying into the unknown. He would be traveling from one cousin's house to the next, from one community of fellow Sogdians to another, staying in their enclaves in the oasis of Turfan, in the caves of Dunhuang, and even deep within China's capital at Chang'an, where a large and vibrant Sogdian community thrived. This network was bound by family ties, a shared language, an Eastern Iranian tongue that became the lingua franca of the route, and a shared culture, creating a chain of credit and trust that was more durable than any empire. A merchant in Bukhara could give a letter of credit to a trader, who could then redeem it for cash from another Sogdian agent 1,000 miles away in China, a system of international finance that defied borders. We know this not from grand histories, but from the most intimate of sources. In 1907, the explorer Aurel Stein was investigating a ruined watchtower near Dunhuang, an oasis on the edge of the Gobi Desert, when he discovered a forgotten mailbag. Inside were several crumpled pieces of paper, a new and precious commodity that had just begun to travel west from China. They were the Sogdian ancient letters, written around 313 CE. These were not the letters of kings or generals. They were the private and commercial correspondence of Sogdian merchants. One is a heartbreaking letter from a woman named Mune, abandoned in Dunhuang by her husband, writing to her mother back in Samarkand, complaining of her fate and begging for help. Other letters detail market conditions, report on the price of silk, and discuss the chaos caused by the recent sacking of the Chinese capital. These letters are a perfect, frozen snapshot of the Sogdian network in action. Personal, commercial, written on paper, and spanning thousands of miles. Their caravans, long trains of Bactrian camels, carried the single most valuable commodity of the age, silk. The Sogdians were the primary movers of this Chinese treasure, buying it in bulk in Chang'an or Lanzhou and beginning the long, perilous journey west. But they traded in everything. They moved Chinese paper, rhubarb, and bronze mirrors westward. They moved Persian metalwork, saffron, and glass, as well as Indian spices and gems in all directions. From the steppe nomads, they bought horses, furs, which they then sold to the Rus, and slaves. But they were not just passive carriers. They were cultural vectors of immense importance. Their multi-confessional culture, they practiced Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and Nestorian Christianity, often simultaneously, made them ideal cultural chameleons. It was Sogdian merchants and monks who were primarily responsible for carrying Buddhism along these same trade routes from India and Central Asia into the oasis states of the Taklamakan and ultimately into the heart of China. They carried Manichaeism, the religion of light, from Persia, and it became a major faith among the Uyghur elite. This role as the world's great intermediaries reached its zenith in 751 CE at the Battle of Talas River. Here, the expanding Abbasid Caliphate, the new Islamic power in the West, clashed with the armies of the Tang dynasty of China. The Arabs won a decisive victory, and among the Chinese prisoners they captured were skilled artisans who knew a secret that China had guarded for centuries, the art of making paper. The Sogdians, now living under Arab rule in Samarkand, immediately recognized the value of this new technology. It was in Samarkand, the Sogdian capital, that the first paper mills outside of China were established, and from there, this revolutionary, inexpensive medium for recording knowledge spread like wildfire throughout the Islamic world, eventually reaching Europe. The Sogdians, true to their nature, had brokered the transfer of one of humanity's most important ideas. Their long dominance of the overland routes had made their cities bywords for wealth. But this very success, this monopoly on the silk and spices of the East, was planting the seeds of ambition in a new and rising maritime power in the West. A city of canals and lagoons that was growing jealous of the endless, costly land route and dreaming of a way to seize the trade for itself, while the Sogdian caravans, for centuries, patiently navigated the deserts and mountains of the long land route. Their precious cargoes of silk, rhubarb, and paper eventually arrived at the great terminals of the West, the ports of the Black Sea, like Trebizond, and the cities of the Levant, like Antioch and Alexandria. It was here, at the seam between Asia and Europe, that a new and improbable power was rising, a city born not on solid ground, but from the salt marsh and the sea. This was Venice, the Serenissima, a city of canals and lagoons, a state that had grown impossibly wealthy by positioning itself as the ultimate and most ruthless European middleman. With the Sogdians and Arabs controlling the supply, Venice resolved to control the distribution, and in doing so, it would build a maritime empire and a golden city from the profits of the very spices and silks that had traveled so far. Venice began its life in the 5th and 6th centuries as a refuge. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed and successive waves of invaders, Goths, Huns, and later Lombards, swept down the Italian peninsula, the people of the mainland fled to the safest place they could find, the inaccessible marshy islands of a shallow, muddy lagoon. This geography was their first and greatest defense. No cavalry could charge across the water, and no deep-drafted warship could navigate the treacherous, shifting channels of the lagoon without a local pilot. This isolation bred a people who were not farmers or landowners, but sailors, salt harvesters, and above all, traders. They were a people facing the sea, their backs to a chaotic Europe, and their first great political allegiance was not to the new barbarian kings of Italy, but to the distant, yet still powerful, Roman emperor in Constantinople. This connection to the Byzantine Empire was the key to their rise. While other European merchants were seen as uncouth foreigners in the sophisticated markets of the East, the Venetians were subjects of the empire. This special status, which they cultivated with cunning diplomacy, eventually culminated in the Golden Bull of 1082, a decree from the Byzantine emperor that granted Venetian merchants the right to trade throughout the empire without paying the heavy customs duties and taxes levied on all others. This was a commercial masterstroke The Venetians became the preferred carriers for the wealth of Constantinople, the very city the Rus Vikings called Miklagard. Their ships carried Byzantine silks, grain, and gold westward, and brought the salt, timber, and slaves of Europe eastward, all while paying virtually no tolls, allowing them to undercut every rival. But the Venetians were not content to be mere servants, and their ambition was matched only by their financial ingenuity. They developed a revolutionary business model known as the commenda, a form of joint stock partnership that perfectly balanced risk and reward. A wealthy stay-at-home investor, the Stans, would provide the majority of the capital for a single trading voyage. A younger, seagoing merchant, the Tractator, would contribute his time, his skill, and perhaps a small portion of the capital, and actually sail with the goods to Alexandria or Constantinople. If the voyage was a success, they would split the profits, often with 3/4 going to the investor and 1/4 to the traveling merchant. This system allowed Venice to mobilize vast sums of private capital, funding dozens of simultaneous voyages and spreading the immense risk of sea trade, ensuring that the loss of a single ship would not bankrupt a family. Their shipyards, the arsenali, became the first true assembly line in history, a state-owned industrial complex that could produce a fully equipped galley warship in a single day. The defining moment of Venetian ascendancy, the act that transformed them from privileged traders to masters of an empire, came in 1204. It was a moment of supreme, cynical opportunism known as the Fourth Crusade. A large army of Frankish knights had assembled at Venice, intending to sail to Egypt to reconquer the Holy Land, but they found themselves unable to pay the staggering fee the Venetians demanded for their transport fleet. The blind, nonagenarian Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a man of legendary cunning, saw his chance. He offered the Crusaders a deal. Their passage would be deferred if they would first help Venice recapture the rebellious Christian city of Zara. After this, he diverted the entire crusade through a complex web of political intrigue, not to Muslim Egypt, but to Christian Constantinople. The Crusaders, with Venetian help, breached the city's ancient walls, and what followed was a 3-day sack of unparalleled brutality, a plundering of the richest city in the world. Venice played its hand perfectly. While the knights carved up the Byzantine territories, Venice claimed what it truly wanted, not land, but 1.25 of the empire, a chain of strategic ports and islands, including Crete and Corfu. These became the fortified bases for their trading galleys, a maritime highway under their total control. They plundered the city of its holiest relics and greatest art, including the 4 great bronze horses that still stand today on the Basilica of St. Mark, a visible triumphalist trophy of their conquest. With their primary rival shattered, a rival they had once served, Venice now held an almost complete monopoly on the eastern trade. All the pepper from India, the cloves from the Moluccas, and the silk from China, which had traveled the monsoon routes and the Silk Road to the ports of the Levant, now controlled by the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, with whom Venice happily traded, had to be loaded onto Venetian ships. This river of spice flowed into the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the massive state-controlled German warehouse on the Grand Canal. Here, merchants from Augsburg, Nuremberg, and the rest of Europe were forced to live and trade, their every transaction monitored and taxed by the Venetian state. The spices that had come so far were now sent on their final leg, carried by donkey train over the Alpine passes into the heart of a Europe that was just reawakening, its appetite for these exotic tastes growing daily. The palaces of the Grand Canal, the shimmering mosaics of St. Mark's, the entire floating, impossible city of marble and gold was a fantasy built on the profits of this trade, a monument to a commercial empire that had hijacked the world's oldest trade routes through finance, warfare, and a singular watery focus. And as Venice grew rich on this southern warm water trade, a different, colder, and equally powerful alliance of merchants was simultaneously building its own monopoly, based not on spice and silk, but on the hard, practical commodities of the northern seas. While the Venetian galleys, sleek and oar-powered, sliced through the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean, building an empire on the high-profit luxuries of silk and spice, a different kind of commerce was taking shape in the cold, gray, and turbulent waters of the north. This was a trade built not on the exotic, but on the essential, not on the desires of the court, but on the needs of the belly and the back. It was a trade of bulk, of heavy, practical, and unglamorous goods, salty, dried fish, thick woolen cloth, towering stacks of timber, barrels of beer, and rivers of grain. This was the world of the Hanseatic League, a commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and their market towns, a city empire that would grow to dominate the trade of the Baltic and North Seas with a power as absolute and as ruthless as Venice's control of the Adriatic. The League's origins were not in a single ambitious city, but in the slow westward migration of German merchants, a movement that began in the 12th century. These merchants, primarily from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg, looked east to the vast, undeveloped, and resource-rich lands of the Baltic coast, a region inhabited by Slavic and pagan tribes. Where others saw wilderness, these merchants saw opportunity. They founded new cities, Rostock, Stralsund, Danzig, Riga, Tallinn, all built on the German model, all facing the sea, all designed as outposts for the systematic exploitation of the northern world's raw materials. Their goal was simple: to connect the resource-rich, grain-growing, and fur-producing East with the populous, cloth-manufacturing, and consumer-heavy West, specifically the markets of Flanders, modern-day Belgium, and England. The technological key to this new, brutal maritime world was not the galley, which was useless in the rough northern seas, but a new type of vessel, the cog. This was a ship built for profit, not for speed. It was a round-hulled, deep-drafted, and clinker-built, with overlapping planks, vessel, powered by a single, large square sail on a single mast. Cogs were slow, clumsy, and sailed poorly against the wind, but they possessed two revolutionary advantages. First, they had a flat bottom, allowing them to sit upright in the mud of tidal estuaries, perfect for the shallow water ports of the north. Second, and most importantly, they had an immense, open cargo hold, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of bulk goods. A single cog could transport a staggering volume of herring or grain, and crucially, it could be operated by a small crew of perhaps 20 sailors. This was a floating box of pure efficiency, the container ship of the medieval world, and it was the workhorse that built the Hanseatic fortune. The League was never a formal state with a single king. It was a flexible, pragmatic, and commercially driven alliance. Its undisputed capital, The queen of the Hansa was the city of Lübeck, strategically positioned on the German Baltic coast, controlling the short overland salt road to Hamburg on the North Sea, thus allowing merchants to bypass the dangerous, pirate-infested waters around the tip of Denmark. The League's power was built on 4 great contore, or foreign trading posts, which were not colonies, but exclusive, walled-off communities of German merchants living in foreign cities. These were the Steelyard in London, the Peterhof in Novgorod, where they met the fur traders coming down the rivers we saw the Russ navigate, the Hanseatic warehouse in Bruges, the gateway to the rich cloth markets of Flanders, and the Briggen in Bergen, Norway. This post in Bergen was perhaps the most striking example of their power. The Hanseatic merchants controlled the entire economy of Norway by controlling one single, vital commodity, dried cod, known as stockfish. The cod was caught in the distant icy Lofoten Islands by Norwegian fishermen, then brought to Bergen, where it was dried rock-hard in the cold air. The Hanseatic merchants at the Briggen, operating as a strict cartel, were the only buyers the fishermen were allowed to sell to. In exchange, the Germans, and only the Germans, were allowed to sell the Norwegians the grain they needed to make bread, a crop that could not grow in their rocky northern land. This monopoly, cod for grain, was ruthlessly enforced, turning the entire kingdom of Norway into a virtual economic dependency of the League. The stockfish, a durable protein-rich food that could last for years, was then shipped south, becoming the staple food for the fast days and Lenten seasons of Catholic Europe, feeding the armies and the poor of the entire continent. This northern network was a vast, circular engine of trade. From the east, from Prussia, Poland, and Livonia, the cogs hauled mountains of rye and wheat, the breadbasket of Europe. They brought in timber, tar, and pitch, the essential naval stores for building the ships of England and Flanders. They brought beeswax for church candles and the rich dark furs from the Novgorod contour. All this flowed west to Bruges and London. In return, the ships were loaded with the fine dyed woolen cloths of Flanders and England, which were then shipped back east to clothe the populations of the Baltic. And cutting across this entire east-west axis was the salt trade. The high-quality bay salt from the French Atlantic coast was shipped north, where it was used in the Baltic's other great fishery, the Scania herring boom, salting millions of fish that were then, in turn, shipped all over Europe. The Hanseatic League, at its height in the 14th century, was a superpower. It had its own parliament, the Hansetag, which met irregularly in Lübeck. It had its own flag, and it had its own navies, which it did not hesitate to use. This was not just a trading guild, it was a political force. When the King of Denmark, Valdemar the Vere, dared to challenge their dominance by sacking the Hanseatic city of Visby in 1361, the League declared war. The United Merchant Cities raised a fleet, defeated the Danish navy, and imposed a humiliating peace, the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370, which granted the Hansa free passage through Danish straits and a virtual veto on the Danish royal succession. This was the high-water mark of their power, a league of merchants that had brought a kingdom to its knees. Theirs was a gray, cold, and pragmatic empire, built not on the whisper of silk, but on the smell of fish, salt, and pine tar, a northern behemoth of bulk goods whose power was a quiet, grinding, and absolute monopoly, a power that far to the east, a Chinese emperor was about to challenge with a fleet of ships that would dwarf everything the world had ever seen. At the very same time that the Hanseatic League was cementing its pragmatic, iron-fisted control over the cold northern seas, built on the bulk trade of cod and rye, an event of an entirely different scale, an enterprise so vast it almost defies comparison, was unfolding on the other side of the world. In the early 15th century, the great ancient empire of China, now under the new and ferociously ambitious Ming dynasty, looked out upon the world, not with the calculating eyes of a merchant, but with the supreme confident gaze of the Middle Kingdom, the center of all earthly civilization. The overland Silk Road, that ancient path of the Sogdians, had become fractured and dangerous with the collapse of the Mongol Empire. The new Ming rulers, having expelled the Mongols and re-established native Chinese rule, were eager to reassert China's traditional dominance, not just on land, but for the first time by sea. The architect of this grand vision was the Yongle Emperor, a usurper who had taken the throne in a bloody civil war and was intensely eager to legitimize his reign with acts of unprecedented grandeur. He moved the capital to a new monumental city he built at Beijing, the Forbidden City, and he ordered the compilation of a colossal encyclopedia of all human knowledge. But his most breathtaking project was the creation of a fleet, an armada so large, so powerful, and so technologically advanced that it would have no equal on Earth for another 500 years. Its purpose was not trade in the Venetian or Hanseatic sense, a quest for profit to enrich a merchant class. Its purpose was political and tributary, to project the awesome, benevolent power of the Ming dynasty across the Western Ocean, to bring the kings and sultans of the world into China's orbit, and to have them offer tribute to the Dragon Throne, acknowledging the Yongle Emperor as the Son of Heaven and the ruler of all under the sky. To command this unprecedented fleet, the emperor chose an extraordinary man, Zheng Hu. He was not a traditional Confucian scholar or a member of the military aristocracy. He was a court eunuch, a man who had been captured as a boy from the province of Yunnan, castrated, and placed in service to the imperial household. Crucially, Zheng He was a Muslim, his family roots tracing back to Central Asia, and he had been raised speaking Arabic and Persian as well as Chinese. This made him the perfect diplomat, a man who could navigate the complex cultural and religious landscape of the Indian Ocean Basin, a world dominated by Islamic sultans and Arab merchants. He was also a towering, physically imposing man, a brilliant organizer, and a soldier of fierce loyalty to the emperor who had raised him from servitude. He was, in short, the perfect instrument of the emperor's will. The fleet that assembled in the shipyards of Nanjing on the Yangtze River staggers the imagination. The flagships of this armada were the Baochuan, the treasure ships, 9-masted vessels that contemporary accounts claim were over 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. If these accounts are even close to accurate, they were more than 4 times the length of the Santa Maria that Columbus would sail 80 years later, and they utterly dwarfed the clumsy 100-foot cogs of the Hanseatic League. These were floating palaces, cities on the water, with watertight bulkheads, a Chinese invention, stern post rudders, and luxurious cabins for diplomats. And they did not sail alone. Each of the 7 voyages that Zheng He would lead between 1405 and 1433 consisted of a massive, combined fleet, sometimes including over 300 vessels. There were the treasure ships, the great horse ships for carrying cavalry, supply ships laden with grain and fresh water for the entire crew, and heavily armed Fuchuan warships to protect the flotilla. The total crew on a single voyage could exceed 27,000 people: sailors, soldiers, doctors, translators, astronomers, and diplomats. Setting sail from Nanjing, this colossal armada would move down the coast, catch the winter monsoon, the same wind the Romans had harnessed but now used with far greater mastery, and sail a route that was already ancient. They traveled to Champa in Vietnam, to Siam, to the port of Malacca, which they helped establish as a key ally and entrepot. From there, they crossed the Indian Ocean, following the established paths to Calicut on India's Malabar coast, the great pepper trading port. But this was not a trading mission. It was a shock and awe campaign of diplomacy. When Zheng He arrived, he did not come to barter. He came bearing gifts: mountains of silk, intricate porcelain, gold, and silver, which he presented to the local rulers. In return, he received their tribute, a formal recognition of the emperor's supremacy, and invited their own ambassadors to return with him to China. If a local ruler, like the king of Sri Lanka, refused to show proper respect, Zheng He's armies would be unleashed, the king deposed, and a more compliant ruler installed in his place. From India, the fleets pushed further into the Persian Gulf, docking at Hormuz, the great trading hub, to the astonishment of the Arab merchants. Most impressively, they sailed to the very western edge of the known world, to the coast of East Africa. The great Chinese ships, their red silk sails filling the sky, appeared off the coasts of Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Malindi in modern-day Kenya. The Swahili sultans of these cities, themselves part of the sophisticated Islamic trading world, were stunned by this visitation. They eagerly offered tribute, and in 1415, Zheng He returned to the Forbidden City with an array of ambassadors and exotic wonders that electrified the imperial court. The greatest of these was a Qilin, a mythical, auspicious beast from Chinese legend whose appearance was said to signal a time of great peace and prosperity under a righteous ruler. This Qilin was in fact a giraffe brought from Malindi, its long neck and gentle demeanor perfectly matching the ancient descriptions. For the Yongle Emperor, this was the ultimate vindication of his reign and the success of his grand maritime project. For nearly 30 years, these great fleets dominated the Indian Ocean, a period of unparalleled Chinese maritime power. Then, in 1433, after the 7th voyage, it simply stopped. The Yongle Emperor was dead, and his successor, the Hongxi Emperor, was a strict Confucianist who saw the voyages as an extravagant, costly, and entirely useless vanity project. The powerful, insular Confucian scholar bureaucracy, who had always hated the power wielded by eunuchs like Zheng He, finally won the political battle. They argued that China was a self-sufficient agricultural empire and that these foreign entanglements were a dangerous distraction and a ruinous expense. The Haijin, or Sea Ban, was enacted, forbidding the construction of ocean-going ships and turning China inward, away from the sea. The great shipyards were dismantled, the fleet was left to rot, and the official records of Zheng He's magnificent voyages were, it is said, deliberately destroyed, seen as a warning against future folly. This abrupt, stunning withdrawal from the world stage was one of history's great turning points. China, which had possessed the technology, the wealth, and the power to circumnavigate and perhaps even colonize the globe, chose isolation. This retreat created a vast power vacuum in the very ocean they had so thoroughly mastered, an empty sea that within just a few decades, a new, desperate, and fiercely ambitious group of sailors from a small kingdom on the edge of Europe would begin to enter, driven by a simple but powerful gamble. The sudden, self-imposed isolation of Ming China, the deliberate rotting of its colossal treasure fleets after 1433, left an almost unimaginable power vacuum in the rich, warm waters of the Indian Ocean. The ancient trade routes, of course, did not cease to exist. The monsoon winds still blew, and Arab dhows and Indian urus continued to ply the familiar paths, carrying the pepper of Malabar, the cloves of the Moluccas, and the silks of a China that still traded, albeit privately. This stream of wealth continued to flow to its old medieval terminals in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, where it was picked up by Mamluk sultans and Venetian merchants who maintained their jealous, iron-fisted, and fabulously profitable monopoly. The spices that arrived in the markets of Europe were still worth more than their weight in gold, their price inflated by 1,000 tolls and 100 middlemen. But now the ocean's great eastern power was gone, and on the extreme western fringe of the Eurasian landmass, a small, poor, and ambitious kingdom was beginning to look at that ocean not as a barrier, but as a challenge and a gamble. This was the kingdom of Portugal, a narrow strip of land on the Atlantic, its back to a Europe dominated by its larger, more powerful neighbor, Spain. The Portuguese were a people forged in the Reconquista, the centuries-long crusade to drive the Muslim Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. This history gave them a potent, perhaps fatalistic combination of maritime skill bred by their long Atlantic coastline and a deep, crusading religious zeal. They were cut off from the Mediterranean's riches, and they knew the only way to break the Venetian Mamluk stranglehold on the spice trade was not to challenge it head-on, an impossible feat, but to bypass it entirely. They began to dream of an Oceano Estrada, a sea road that would take them south around the vast unknown continent of Africa and directly into the Indian Ocean, seizing the source of the spice trade for themselves. This grand, desperate project, which would span an entire century, was the vision of one man, Prince Henry, whom history would call the Navigator. Henry was not a sailor. He was a royal patron, a strategist, a grand master of a crusading order. From his rocky, windswept promontory at Sagres, on the very southwestern tip of Europe, he gathered the best cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and Jewish mathematicians, and he sponsored, year after year, the first systematic, state-driven voyages of exploration. This was not a quest for profit alone, but a tangle of motives. To find the source of the West African gold that trickled across the Sahara, to continue the crusade against Islam, and to find the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John, believed to be somewhere in Africa or Asia, who could become a grand ally in a final, global pincer movement against the Muslim world. The challenges were terrifying. The Atlantic was not the predictable Mediterranean. Its winds and currents were complex and forbidding. The greatest psychological barrier was Cape Bojador, a desolate headland on the African coast. For generations, sailors had believed this was the uncrossable Sea of Darkness, a place of boiling water, sea monsters, and winds from which no ship could ever return. It took Henry 15 attempts before one of his captains, Gil Eanes, in 1434, finally forced his ship far out into the open ocean, out of sight of land, and catching a favorable wind, sailed cleanly past the cape, shattering the ancient terror. This was the breakthrough, and it required a new kind of ship to do it. This was the caravel, a small, light, and agile vessel. Unlike the square-sailed Hanseatic cog, the caravel used triangular lateen sails, an innovation borrowed from the Arab dhows of the Indian Ocean. This sail design was revolutionary, allowing a ship, for the first time, to tack, to sail in a zigzag pattern against the wind, the one essential technology needed to guarantee a return voyage from the contrary winds of the African coast. With this new ship and a newfound courage, the Portuguese began a slow, painful, generation-spanning crawl south. They rediscovered and colonized Madeira and the Azores, turning them into sugar plantations, a profitable, if dark, venture. They pushed past the Senegal River, finding the Gold Coast and bringing back gold dust, and in 1441 they brought back another cargo, the first African captives sold in the markets of Lagos, beginning the tragic and brutal Atlantic slave trade. This grim commerce became a dark funding mechanism for further exploration. Decade after decade, they pushed further. Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River in 1482. Then, in 1487, King John II dispatched Bartolomeu Dias to find the continent's end. Dias sailed south until he was caught in a ferocious 13-day storm that blew his small caravels far out into the unknown, frigid waters of the South Atlantic. When the storm cleared, he turned east to find the coast, but there was only empty ocean. With a dawning, terrifying realization, he turned north and finally made landfall on a coast that was running northeast. He had done it. He had been blown around the bottom of Africa without even seeing it. He had found the passage. His weeping, exhausted, and mutinous crew forced him to turn back. But as he passed the great headland on his return, he named it the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. His king, seeing the map, knew its true meaning, and renamed it the Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope. The path was now open. A decade later, in 1497, a new king, Manuel III, dispatched a commander to finish the gamble. This was Vasco da Gama, a tough, ruthless, and brilliant navigator given command of 4 small, heavily armed ships. He was not just an explorer. He was the leader of an armed trade mission, the tip of a spear. Using Dias's charts, he made an audacious navigational decision. Instead of crawling down the coast, he swung his fleet in a great, open ocean arc far out into the South Atlantic, almost to Brazil, to catch the powerful westerly winds that would swing him back around the Cape of Good Hope. It worked. He rounded the Cape and sailed into the unknown waters of the Indian Ocean, arriving on the sophisticated, wealthy Swahili coast of East Africa, an ancient Islamic trading world. In Malindi, he fought, he threatened, and he finally managed to hire a local pilot, a master of the monsoon, who in 23 days guided the battered Portuguese fleet across the final stretch of open water. In May 1498, after a journey of 10 months, Vasco da Gama's ships, their hulls fouled, their surviving crews skeletal and rotting from scurvy, dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, India, the great pepper trading port the Romans had known. He had done it. The sea road was open. The meeting with Calicut's ruler, the Zamorin, was a farce. The Portuguese gifts of woolen cloth and wash basins were laughed at in a court that draped itself in silk and gold. The Arab merchants, recognizing the mortal, existential threat that had just sailed in, immediately denounced the Portuguese as pirates. Da Gama had to use his ship's cannons, his one crucial advantage, to fight his way out of the harbor, managing to secure only a small token cargo of pepper and cinnamon. The voyage home was a nightmare. He lost half his ships and half his men to disease. But when his surviving vessel, the Barrio, limped into Lisbon in 1089, the spices he carried, though meager, were sold for a profit 60 times the original cost of the entire expedition. The gamble had paid off. The Venetian monopoly was strategically broken. The path was open, and Portugal now knew that it would have to return not as merchants, but as armed conquerors to seize this trade with the one thing they had that the East did not: ships of war bristling with cannon. Vasco da Gama's violent, epic-making return to Lisbon in 1499 was a triumph of the southern route, a brutal confirmation that Africa could be rounded and that the spice-rich Indian Ocean could be seized by a cannon-pointed sea road. But just 7 years earlier, Portugal's great rival, the newly unified Kingdom of Spain, had placed a bet on a different, seemingly more elegant, and far more radical gamble. This was the vision championed by a tenacious and profoundly mistaken Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. He believed, based on a tangle of flawed calculations and wishful geography, that the world was much smaller than it truly was, and that the East, the land of silk, gold, and spices, could be reached not by a perilous, decade-spanning crawl around Africa, but by a single, bold westward dash across the open Atlantic. In 1492, the same year they finally expelled the last Moorish kingdom from Granada, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella funded this desperate westward probe, hoping to beat the Portuguese to the riches of Asia. On October 12th, 1492, after a 5-week voyage, Columbus and his small fleet, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, made landfall on an island in the Bahamas. He was convinced he had found the Indies, the outlying islands of Japan or China. He had not. He had stumbled upon the shores of an immense, previously isolated biosphere, a new world whose existence was unknown to the entirety of the old world of Eurasia and Africa. This single event, this accidental collision of two long-separated hemispheres, set in motion the single most profound biological event in human history, an event we now call the Columbian Exchange. This was not a trade route in the sense of merchants carrying silks and salts. It was a sudden, violent, and irreversible transfer of every living thing, plants, animals, and most devastatingly microorganisms, across the Atlantic. It was the moment that truly, and often tragically, reconnected the continents, forging a single global ecosystem for the first time since Pangaea. The consequences for the New World were immediate and catastrophic, a biological apocalypse. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had migrated there millennia before, had lived in profound isolation. They had no domesticated herd animals like cattle, horses, or pigs, and as a result, they had never been exposed to the zoonotic diseases that had evolved in the crowded, intermingled populations of Old World farmers and their livestock. They had zero immunological defenses. The arrival of the Europeans unleashed what is now known as the Great Dying. Smallpox, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, typhus, cholera, diseases that were endemic and often survivable childhood illnesses in Europe, swept through the Americas like a wildfire. Entire civilizations were hollowed out, sometimes by 90 to 95%, before the European armies even arrived. The mighty Aztec and Inca empires, which we will visit, were not conquered merely by a few hundred conquistadors. They were conquered by invisible microbes, which shattered their social order and left a bewildered, grieving, and weakened population in their wake. In the other direction, the Old World sent its biological arsenal, which remade the very landscape of the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors brought their greatest weapon of conquest, an animal that had vanished from the Americas in the last ice age, the horse. The horse revolutionized warfare and later the hunting culture of the plains, creating the iconic image of the mounted buffalo hunter. But even more transformative were the mundane, relentless animals of European agriculture. Pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats were set loose, and in a continent with no natural predators equipped to hunt them and no diseases to check them, their populations exploded. Vast herds of feral cattle and pigs swarmed across the land, devouring native plants, reshaping the ecology, and providing a walk-in, self-replicating food source for the European colonists. Alongside them came the plants of Europe: wheat, barley, rye, and most fatefully, sugarcane. The warm, humid islands of the Caribbean, where Columbus had first landed, proved to be the perfect environment for this one crop, a commodity that would soon become the white gold of this new world, fueling a new and even darker economic system. From the New World, a different kind of life flowed eastward, a transfer that would in turn revolutionize the Old World, sparking a population boom that would fuel the coming centuries of industrial and imperial expansion. The first and most humble of these treasures was the potato. This nutritious, calorie-dense tuber, domesticated high in the Andes, could grow in the poor, damp, cold soils of northern Europe, in places like Ireland, Germany, and Russia, where wheat and barley failed. It became the food of the new European peasantry, providing the caloric surplus that would feed the armies of Napoleon and the workers of the Industrial Revolution. Almost as important was zea maize, or corn, a fantastically adaptable and high-yield grain that could thrive in climates from Africa to China, in many cases supplementing or replacing rice and millet, becoming a new staple for hundreds of millions. This New World bounty reshaped the cultures and cuisines of the entire planet. The tomato, carried from Mexico to Spain and then to Italy, was initially feared as a poison, but would eventually become the fundamental ingredient of Italian cuisine. Chili peppers, also from the Americas, spread like wildfire along the old trade routes, arriving in India, Southeast Asia, and China, where they permanently and profoundly altered the local food, creating the spicy flavors we now associate with those regions. Vanilla and cacao, the source of chocolate, became new global luxuries, while peanuts and cassava became vital new food sources in Africa. And one plant, tobacco, became the world's first truly global, recreational, and addictive cash crop, creating fortunes in the new colony of Virginia. This exchange, born of Columbus's great mistake, had irrevocably rebound the planet, for good and for ill. The diseases had cleared a path for conquest, but the new foods would create the populations of the modern era. In this new, two-ocean world, now connected, needed a currency, a single commodity to fuel this nascent global economy, a treasure that the Spanish were about to find in a mountain of pure silver. The Columbian Exchange had violently and permanently sutured the two hemispheres of the planet, mixing their plants, their animals, and their diseases in an irreversible biological torrent. But this new, globalized world, born of Columbus's great navigational error, needed a currency, a single, universally accepted medium of value to lubricate its new intersecting trade routes. The Portuguese had rounded Africa, desperate to trade for spices. The Spanish had found a new world, and they were desperate for a commodity that would allow them to participate in that same lucrative Asian trade. They had not found a new path to the Indies, but in their brutal conquest of this new land, they would find the very fuel for the world's first truly global economy. They would find a mountain and a river of pure silver, and with it, they would forge the final missing link in the chain of global trade, the long, lonely trans-Pacific route of the Manila galleons. The first wave of Spanish conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés against the Aztecs, 1521, and Francisco Pizarro against the Inca, 1533, had been driven by a raw medieval lust for oro, for gold. They had melted down the priceless, sacred artworks of these fallen empires, the golden masks and sun discs, into crude bars, a plunder of accumulated wealth that, while vast, was ultimately finite. The real, unimaginable treasure was not the gold in the temples, but the silver in the earth. In 1545, on a high, barren, and freezing plateau in the Andes of what is today Bolivia, a local llama herder, it is said, stumbled upon an outcrop of rock that glittered with veins of silver so pure they could be seen with the naked eye. This was the Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosi, a literal mountain of silver ore. Almost simultaneously, far to the north in Mexico, the Spanish discovered the great silver veins of Zacatecas. The plunder of conquest was over. The industrial-scale extraction of wealth had begun. These two mines became the twin hearts of the Spanish Empire, pumping silver, the blood of the new global economy, into its arteries. Potosi, in particular, became a legend, a byword for incomprehensible wealth. A city, one of the world's largest, sprang up almost overnight at 13,000 feet, a chaotic, violent, and fabulously wealthy boomtown in the clouds, its silver funding the wars of the Spanish kings in Europe. This wealth was extracted at a horrific human cost. The Spanish implemented a twisted version of the old Inca forced labor system, the mita, compelling thousands of indigenous men to toil in the deep, dark, and collapsing tunnels of the mountain, where they died by the thousands from accidents, exhaustion, and most insidiously, from mercury poisoning. This was because the Spanish had adopted a new, revolutionary refining technique, the patio process, which used mercury, itself mined at another hellish site, Huancavelica, to efficiently extract the silver from the raw ore. This was a brutal, industrial machine for creating money. Now Spain had its commodity, a river of silver, pieces of 8, reale de a ocho, which would become the world's first global currency, trusted from London to Istanbul. But Spain's problem was geographical. Its great rival, Portugal, now controlled the sea road east around Africa to the spices of India. Spain, stuck with the Americas, was on the wrong side of the world. Its silver was in the New World, but the goods it craved, the silks of China, the porcelain, the lacquerware, the spices, were in the Far East. The solution was to forge a new route, a Spanish route, westward across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean. In 1565, an expedition led by Miguel López de Legazpi successfully and violently established a permanent Spanish foothold in a group of islands that had been found by Magellan decades earlier. They named them Las Islas Filipinas, the Philippines, in honor of King Philip II. In 1571, they conquered the local Muslim port of Manila and founded their new capital, Manila. Manila was a stroke of strategic genius. It was a Spanish-controlled fortress city, a European outpost, planted just off the coast of China, at the very doorstep of the Ming dynasty. This was the missing piece, the entrepot that would finally connect the Americas to Asia. Thus began the legendary and uniquely arduous trade of the Manila galleons. The system was a great two-part circle. First, the river of silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas was hauled by mule train to the great Pacific port of Acapulco on the coast of Mexico. Here, once a year, the great galleon, a massive, treasure-laden, and heavily armed merchant ship, would take on its cargo of plata. Catching the reliable trade winds, it would sail west, a 2 to 3 month journey across the largest and loneliest ocean on Earth, its only stopping point the island of Guam, until it arrived in the humid, bustling harbor of Manila. The arrival of the Acapulco galleon set off a flurry of activity. In Manila, the Spanish did not need to trade with the locals. They traded with the world that came to them. From the north, from the Chinese province of Fujian, came the great junks, fleets of merchant ships drawn by the gravitational pull of American silver. Ming China, at this very moment, was undergoing a massive economic change. Its government had abandoned its old, failing paper currency and had remonetized its entire tax system on silver. The demand for silver in China was effectively infinite, and the Spanish had a mountain of it. The Chinese merchants, therefore, eagerly exchanged their most precious goods for the silver pieces of 8. Into the galleon's hold went the treasures of the East, tens of thousands of bolts of shimmering raw Chinese silk, intricate carved ivory, fragrant spices like clove and cinnamon, delicate translucent porcelain, which became the rage of Europe, and beautiful dark lacquerware. With its hold now empty of silver and filled with the priceless luxuries of Asia, the galleon began the second and far more brutal leg of its journey, the tourneviage, or return trip. This was one of the most difficult and grueling sailing routes in the world. To get back to Mexico, the ship could not sail against the trade winds. Instead, it had to sail far north, almost to the coast of Japan, to an area of cold, stormy seas, to catch the great Kuroshio current and the prevailing westerly winds. For 4, 5, or even 6 months, the ship would be battered by storms, its crew isolated, starving, and dying of scurvy, a long, hellish passage until it finally, blessedly, sighted the coast of California and limped back down to Acapulco. But the journey was not over. At Acapulco, this Asian treasure was unloaded and hauled, again by mule train, on an overland road straight across the entire breadth of Mexico, a silk road of the New World, to the port of Veracruz on the Atlantic coast. In Veracruz, the silks and porcelains were loaded onto the other great Spanish fleet, the treasure fleet, which had come from Spain. This fleet would rendezvous with the other stream of silver, the portion from Potosi that had been shipped up to Panama, hauled across the isthmus, and loaded at the Atlantic port of Portobelo. This combined fleet of treasure, carrying the silver of the Americas and the silks of Asia, would then sail in a heavily armed convoy, the Flota de Indias, back across the Atlantic to the one port in Spain where all this wealth was legally allowed to enter, Seville. This vast, complex, and perilous system, from Pilex, Bolivia to Acapulco, Acapulco to Manila, Manila back to Acapulco, Acapulco to Veracruz, and Veracruz to Spain, was the world's first truly global trade route, a silver-plated spine that for the first time in human history connected all the populated continents in a single, continuous, and world-changing economic loop. The Spanish galleons, those magnificent, lumbering treasure chests, had successfully stitched the globe together with a thread of pure silver, connecting the mines of the Andes to the markets of Manila, and in doing so, had created a truly global, state-controlled circuit of wealth. This wealth, however, was royal wealth, the personal property of the King of Spain, funding his armies, his palaces, and his European wars. But as this silver-plated spine was operating, a new kind of power was being born in the cold, wet, and foggy north of Europe, in a tiny, rebellious nation that had just fought a desperate, decades-long war to win its independence from that same Spanish king. This was the Dutch Republic, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, a nation of merchants, shipbuilders, and Calvinists, a people who, like the Venetians, were born from the sea and who saw the world not as a place to crusade, but as a balance sheet. These Dutch merchants, who had long grown rich as the gritty, pragmatic carriers of the Hanseatic trade, hauling Baltic grain, Norwegian fish, and French salt, looked at the new oceanic routes with envy and calculation. They had seen the Portuguese gamble pay off, returning with pepper, and they had seen the Spanish silver flow, but they saw both as inefficiently run state monopolies, hobbled by royal bureaucracy and religious dogma. The Dutch, hardened by their long war, were relentlessly practical, innovative, and driven by a singular motive: profit. They decided that they would not just compete with the Portuguese, they would replace them, and they would do it by creating an entirely new kind of commercial weapon, an entity the world had never seen before. The problem, as ever, was risk. A single voyage to the East Indies, around Africa, was phenomenally expensive, and the chance of a ship, or an entire fleet, being lost to storms, disease, or Portuguese cannons was terrifyingly high. The old Commenda model of the Venetians, which funded a single voyage, was no longer sufficient for this kind of global, high-stakes enterprise. The Dutch needed a way to mobilize more capital, and crucially, to make that capital permanent. Their solution, unveiled in 1602, was an act of financial genius that would echo down the centuries. They merged all their competing small trading companies into one single, state-sanctioned behemoth, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known simply as the VOC. The VOC was not just a company, it was the world's first multinational corporation, and it was the first company to ever be financed by the public through the sale of stock. For the first time, any citizen of the new republic, from a wealthy regent to a humble shopkeeper, could buy a share of the VOC's future, their capital pooled together in a permanent indestructible fund. This fund would not be dissolved after one voyage, but would be managed by a board of directors, the Heron 17th or 17 gentlemen. These shares could then be bought and sold by other investors on a new dedicated marketplace, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first. The VOC was a revolutionary idea, a private enterprise owned by its shareholders that was not dependent on the whims of a king, but solely on its ability to return a dividend. And to ensure it could return that dividend, the Dutch government, the Staten General, gave the VOC a charter that granted it powers that seem staggering to us today. The VOC was given a complete 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. But far more than that, it was given the right to act as a sovereign state. The company, this private corporation, could negotiate treaties with foreign kings, build its own fortresses, maintain its own standing armies and war fleets, appoint its own governors, and most critically, wage war, depose rulers, and administer colonies. It was a nation-state disguised as a business, a corporate predator, unleashed upon the rich and ancient trade routes of the East, its sole directive to secure a monopoly on the spice trade by any means necessary. The VOC did not repeat the Portuguese mistake of simply building trading posts and harassing Arab merchants. It went, with brutal, surgical precision, for the source. The Portuguese had controlled the sea lanes. The VOC was determined to control the land where the spices actually grew. Its primary target was the Moluccas, the fabled spice islands of modern-day Indonesia, the only places on Earth where cloves, nutmeg, and mace could be found. The Portuguese were violently expelled. The English, who had also arrived, were bloodily pushed aside. But the true, horrifying nature of this new corporate power was revealed in the Banda Islands, the tiny volcanic archipelago that held an absolute global monopoly on nutmeg and mace. The Bandanese people had long traded with Arab, Indian, and Javanese merchants, and they saw no reason to sell their harvest exclusively to the newly arrived and intensely demanding Dutch. In 1621, the VOC's Governor-General, the infamously ruthless John Petersoen Cohen, a man who famously wrote, "We cannot make war without trade, nor trade without war," decided to end this problem permanently. He sailed to the Banda Islands with a fleet of warships and an army of mercenaries. In what can only be described as a deliberate corporate-run genocide, his forces systematically depopulated the islands, massacring, enslaving, or driving away almost the entire population of 15,000 people. He then redivided the land into perkin, or nutmeg plantations, and imported slaves from other islands to work them. The VOC had not just secured a trade, it had created a factory, a slave-driven plantation system, and it now held the world's supply of nutmeg in its iron fist, its price dictated not by the market, but by the Heron 16th in Amsterdam. Cohen established the VOC's great Asian capital at a Javanese port he razed to the ground, rebuilding it as a fortified Dutch city, a new Amsterdam in the tropics, Batavia, which we know today as Jakarta. From this new headquarters, the VOC extended its tentacles. It established a trading post in Japan at Dejima, becoming the only Europeans allowed to trade with the isolationist shogunate. It conquered parts of Sri Lanka to control the cinnamon trade. It built a resupply station at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, the seed of the future nation. The VOC was a new kind of empire, a corporate commercial web that for nearly 2 centuries dominated the seas, its vast wealth flowing back to Amsterdam, funding the brilliant canvases of Rembrandt and the lens grinding of Spinoza. This Dutch Golden Age was financed by this new, ruthless, and highly efficient machine. And this same model, this combination of corporate finance, plantation agriculture, and an insatiable desire for a single, lucrative commodity, was simultaneously being applied in a new and even more brutal triangular pattern that was forming in the ocean that the Dutch, English, and French all shared, the Atlantic. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had perfected a new and terrible kind of business model in the East, a corporate, plantation-based system fueled by permanent capital and secured by genocide, all to monopolize a single, coveted luxury. The Banda Islands, depopulated and given over to slave-run nutmeg farms, were a chilling blueprint, a dark innovation in the history of trade. But this ruthless logic, this cold arithmetic of profit and forced labor, was not confined to the Spice Islands of the Pacific. At the very same moment, a parallel and even larger system was being forged in the ocean that now connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas, a system that would be defined by 3 distinct legs, a brutal new economy that history would come to call the Dark Triangle. This, too, was a trade driven by an insatiable new European appetite, not for spice this time, but for sweetness. The commodity at the heart of this new Atlantic world was sugar. This white gold, once a rare and costly medicinal spice sold by apothecaries, was being transformed by the new, hot, and humid colonies of the West Indies and Brazil into a bulk commodity, a mass market addiction. The islands of the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, were found to be the perfect environment for growing sugar cane. But sugar cultivation is not farming. It is a brutal, pre-modern industry. It requires a massive, year-round, and physically crushing labor force to plant the cane, to harvest it with machetes in the blistering sun, and most critically, to feed it immediately into the grinding mills and boiling houses where the juice was reduced into crystals in a hot, dangerous, and 24-hour process. The indigenous populations, as we saw, had been almost entirely erased by the Great Dying, and European indentured servants could not, or would not, endure the lethally harsh conditions. This intense, industrial demand for labor, met by a catastrophic labor shortage, found its solution in the long-standing, pre-existing slave trades of Africa. The Portuguese, in their slow crawl down the African coast, had begun this grim commerce, and now it was scaled up, industrialized, and financed by the same northern European nations that had perfected corporate finance: the Dutch, the French, and above all, the British. Thus, the great 3-part Atlantic Circuit was born. The first leg began in the great rising ports of Europe, cities like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Amsterdam, whose harbors grew thick with a new generation of ships built specifically for this trade. They did not sail empty. Their holds were packed with the manufactured goods of a burgeoning Europe: colorful textiles from Manchester, iron bars, metalware like pots and basins, fine glass beads, and most crucially, gunpowder and cheap, mass-produced muskets. They also carried barrels of alcohol, particularly the harsh, strong rum that was itself a product of this new economy. The ships sailed south, their first destination being the slave coast of West Africa, a long stretch of shoreline from modern-day Ghana to Nigeria. Here the European captains did not, as is often imagined, sail inland to capture people themselves. They sailed to establish coastal trading forts, or factories, like Cape Coast Castle or Elmina. Here they entered into complex and often lengthy negotiations with powerful African kings and merchants who had built their own empires on a new internal economy, the capture and sale of human beings. The European guns and gunpowder that flowed in became the very tools that fueled the wars inland, creating a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of violence, where armies marched to capture more people to sell for more guns. The enslaved, men, women, and children, prisoners of war, or victims of kidnapping, were marched to the coast, branded with the mark of the trading company, and held in dark, suffocating dungeons known as barracoons until the ships were ready. Then came the second leg of the triangle, the journey that has no parallel in its systematic, commercialized dehumanization, the Middle Passage. The human cargo was packed into the holds of the ships, a dark arithmetic of maximizing bodies per square foot. Two packs were debated, the loose pack, which gave more room, in the hopes that a lower mortality rate would yield more survivors, or the tight pack, which crammed every possible space, accepting a higher death rate as a simple cost of doing business. The captives lay chained, side by side on rough wooden shelves, often with less than 2 feet of headroom, unable to stand, sometimes even to sit up, for the entire 2 to 3 month voyage. The holds were a living hell, a place of unimaginable suffering, thick with the stench of dysentery, vomit, and death. A darkness broken only by the periodic, brutal rituals of being forced on deck for exercise. Disease, smallpox, dysentery, scurvy was rampant, and the mortality rate was catastrophic, with an average of 15% of the human cargo dying on any given crossing, their bodies simply thrown to the sharks that learned to follow these ships. Upon arrival in the West Indies or Brazil, the third leg began. The surviving, terrified, and broken captives, the cargo that had made it, were brought to the great slave markets of Kingston, Bridgetown, or Rio de Janeiro. They were seasoned, cleaned, and oiled to look healthy, then sold at auction to the highest bidder, the plantation owners. The cash from their sale was immediately used to purchase the very product their forced labor would now create. The ship's holds, now horribly empty, were scrubbed clean and filled to the capacity with the products of the plantations. Hogsheads of raw sugar, barrels of dark, sticky molasses, and bundles of tobacco, or later raw cotton. The ships, now heavy with this new colonial wealth, sailed back to Europe, completing the triangle. In ports like Bristol, the sugar was refined, the tobacco was sold, and the cotton was fed into the new mills of an industrializing England. The true dark genius of this system was its perfect closed loop. The molasses, a thick, cheap byproduct of the sugar boiling process, was often shipped not just to England, but to the new enterprising colonies of New England. In cities like Boston and Newport, this molasses was distilled into the very same harsh, potent rum that the ships had first carried. This American-made rum was then loaded onto ships, which sailed to Africa to be traded for more enslaved people who were then carried to the Caribbean to produce more sugar and molasses, which was then shipped to New England to be made into more rum. It was a perfect, self-fueling engine of profit, a dark triangle whose 3 points were inextricably linked, each leg financing the next, each vertex a site of immense, specialized industry, manufactured goods from Europe, human bodies from Africa, and plantation crops from the Americas. This trade, which transported over 12 million human beings, was not a sideshow of the Atlantic economy. For 2 centuries, it was the Atlantic economy, building the fortunes of empires and laying a dark, brutal foundation for the modern industrial world that was about to be born. The dark, looping, and immensely profitable engine of the Atlantic Triangle, this trade in sugar and human bodies, had generated colossal fortunes, particularly in the port cities of Britain, France, and the Netherlands. This accumulated capital, this river of blood-stained gold, did not sit idle. It sought new opportunities for investment, and it found one in a revolution that was beginning to whisper in the coal fields and iron foundries of the English Midlands. This was a new kind of power, born not of wind, water, or muscle, the ancient prime movers of all human history, but of fire and pressure. It was the Industrial Revolution, and its beating mechanical heart was the steam engine. This invention, first perfected by men like James Watt to pump water from deep, flooding coal mines, would soon break free of its stationary chains, be placed upon wheels of iron, and most momentously of all, be lowered into the belly of a ship, destined to shrink the oceans and master the globe in a way the age of sail could never have imagined. For millennia, the merchant ship, whether it was a Roman corbeta or a Dutch VOC Floyd, was a prisoner of the wind. Its passages were dictated by the seasons, its speed was a gamble, and its arrival time was a hope, not a schedule. The monsoon winds that Hippolytus had harnessed, the trade winds that Columbus had followed, these were the great, impersonal masters of all global commerce. A ship could be becalmed for weeks in the agonizing, glassy stillness of the doldrums, its crew helpless, its cargo rotting, its profits evaporating under a merciless sun. The steam engine offered a radical, almost blasphemous promise. A ship that carried its own wind, a ship that could move against the current, a ship that could defy the gale, a ship that could run on a timetable. This was a change as profound as the invention of the sail itself, and it would reforge the world's trade routes. The first attempts were clumsy, hesitant, and confined to the calm waters of rivers and lakes. Robert Fulton's Clermont, which began puffing its way up the Hudson River in 1807, and Henry Bell's Comet on the Clyde in 1812, were seen by many as noisy, dirty, and dangerous novelties, smoke jacks that fouled the air and were prone to boiler explosions. Taking this fragile, fire-breathing technology onto the open, violent expanse of the Atlantic seemed a fool's errand. The early steam engines were monstrously inefficient, consuming mountains of coal. A ship attempting a transatlantic voyage, it was argued, would need to carry a cargo of coal so vast that there would be no room left for any paying cargo at all. The first vessel to try, the Savannah in 1819, was a perfect symbol of this anxiety. She was a full-rigged sailing ship with a small auxiliary steam engine. Her retractable paddle wheels were engaged for only a handful of days on her month-long journey. She was a sailing ship that carried a novelty, not a true steamship. The man who shattered this barrier was a titan of the new age of iron, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was a poet of engineering, a man who saw the new mathematics of industry with perfect clarity. He understood that a ship's carrying capacity increases with the cube of its dimensions, while its resistance in the water only increases with the square. The answer then was not to build small, cautious ships, but to build big. In 1838, his Great Western was unleashed, a wooden-hulled Leviathan, a steam cathedral with towering masts, for Brunel was still a prudent man, but an engine powerful enough to cross the Atlantic in 15 days. It began the first regular, scheduled transatlantic steam service. The age of the wind was dying. The age of the schedule was born. A merchant in Liverpool could now sign a contract promising that his textiles would be in New York on a specific date, a feat of commercial precision that was previously impossible. This revolution was then perfected by two other innovations that Brunel himself would champion. The first was the screw propeller, far more efficient and robust than the clumsy, vulnerable paddle wheels that lifted out of the water in heavy seas. The second, and more fundamental, was the material of the ships themselves. Wood had reached its physical limit. A wooden ship much larger than the Great Western would simply tear itself apart in the open ocean. The answer was iron, and soon after, cheap, mass-produced steel from the fiery new furnaces of Henry Bessemer. Brunel's next masterpiece, the Great Britain of 1843, was the template for the modern world, a massive, ocean-going vessel with an iron hull and a screw propeller. This was the key. A steel hull was stronger, lighter, and could be made almost infinitely larger than a wooden one. It could also be divided into the watertight compartments that Zheng Hu had used 4 centuries earlier, making voyages immeasurably safer. The impact was total. The new, more efficient compound engines burned less coal, allowing ships to carry more cargo. The sheer volume of trade exploded as the cost per ton plummeted. The world's trade routes, which for millennia had been broad, seasonal, and meandering, were now drawn as thin, straight, and permanent lines across the map. The age of steam and steel did more than just speed up the old routes. It created entirely new ones. Perishable goods that were once impossible to trade, long distance became staples of the global economy. Refrigeration, itself a product of this new industrial science, was added to the steel hulls, and for the first time, beef from Argentina, lamb from New Zealand, and fruit from the tropics could be delivered fresh to the dinner tables of the new, sprawling industrial cities of Europe. Grain from the vast, newly opened plains of the American Midwest could be moved by another new machine, the railroad, to the coast, loaded into the deep steel bellies of these new ships, and sent to feed the very factory workers who had built them. The world's web of trade was no longer a delicate, wind-blown thing. It was a hard, pounding, and relentless machine, a circulatory system of fire and steel. And this new machine had no patience for the long, looping detours of geography, like the ancient 10,000-mile voyage around the Cape of Good Hope. The steam engine, that heart of fire and pressure, had successfully conquered the world's oceans, taming them with the relentless pounding rhythm of its pistons and the sharp, slicing power of its steel screw propellers. But this revolution was not confined to the water. In a perfect, parallel expression of this new industrial power, The same machine was being placed on iron wheels, and those wheels were being set upon iron rails, creating a new kind of artery that would do for the continents what the steamship had done for the seas. This was the railroad, the iron horse, a creature of smoke and spee that would, for the first time in human history, shatter the ancient suffocating tyranny of inland distance. For all of history, from the Persian royal road to the Roman highways, land transport had been a prisoner of the hoof and the foot, of the ox cart, the mule train, and the camel caravan. It was slow, agonizingly expensive, and limited by the endurance of living muscle, a fragile chain of fodder and water. True wealth, the movement of bulk goods like grain or stone, could only travel by water. Continents were, in effect, vast, impassable land oceans, their deep interiors known only to the nomads, the trappers, and the subsistence farmers who lived and died within a few miles of their birth. The railroad changed this, instantly and forever. It was a land ship, a steamship on rails, and it could go where no river or canal could ever dream of going. It could climb mountains, bridge chasms, and most importantly, it could drive in a straight, uncompromising, and profitable line across the empty, fertile voids that defined the 19th century world. The most potent and iconic example of this continental conquest unfolded across the vast new nation of the United States. In the mid-19th century, America was two separate countries, divided by a 2,000-mile expanse of prairie, desert, and the formidable snow-choked barrier of the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains. To get from New York to the new, gold-rich state of California, a traveler had two terrible options: a 6-month, 13,000-mile sea voyage around the ice and storms of Cape Horn, or a 2-month, hideously dangerous overland trek by wagon train, a journey haunted by disease, drought, and conflict. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was an act of national will, a steel suture designed to bind the nation together after its bloody Civil War. It was an engineering project on a scale the world had never seen, an assault on the wilderness. From the east in Omaha, the Union Pacific Railroad, built largely by the hard, back-breaking labor of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, began laying track westward across the vast, flat, oceanic plains of the prairie, the homeland of the Sioux and the bison. From the west, in Sacramento, the Central Pacific, financed by the Big Four merchant princes, began its even more daunting task, climbing and conquering the Sierra Nevada, an almost vertical 7,000-foot wall of solid granite. This seemingly impossible feat was accomplished by the tireless and largely unsung labor of over 15,000 Chinese workers who had been recruited for their skill and their resilience. They were lowered in wicker baskets down sheer cliff faces to chip away at the rock, and they learned to use the volatile new explosive, nitroglycerin, to blast the tunnels, inch by agonizing inch, through the mountain's heart, their progress measured in feet per day, their lives often the cost of that progress. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in the Utah desert, the two lines met. A golden spike was ceremoniously, if gently, tapped into the final laurelwood tie, and a telegraph signal flashed across the nation. Done. The continent was conquered. A journey that had taken months was now reduced to a single week. But this was not just a transportation route. It was an economic big bang. The railroad created the modern American interior. The prairies, long dismissed as the Great American Desert, were now revealed as the richest farmland on Earth. Settlers poured in, their passage paid for by the railroad, and they settled on land given to them by the railroad. They used new steel plows to break the ancient sod, and the railroads then carried their resulting, continent-spanning oceans of wheat, corn, and barley to the ports, where the new steamships, which we just visited, were waiting to carry that grain to feed the hungry industrial cities of Europe. The vast herds of bison were systematically exterminated, in part to feed the railroad crews, but primarily to clear the plains for the new cattle kingdom, where millions of longhorn cattle, driven north from Texas, were loaded onto specialized cattle cars at new railside cow towns, shipped to the great mechanized slaughterhouses of Chicago, and then shipped east again in the new refrigerated rail cars as beef. The Iron Horse had turned an empty continent into the world's breadbasket and butcher shop, a vast gridded factory for the production of food. This same logic of imperial control and economic exploitation was being applied across the globe. In Imperial Russia, the czars faced the same problem as the Persian kings: how to control a landmass that stretched across 11 time zones. Their solution was the Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, the longest single railway line in the world. This was a steel artery, a political railroad designed to move soldiers and administrators to the Pacific, binding the wild fur-rich land of Siberia, which the Rus had once navigated by river, to the heartland in Moscow, projecting Russian power into Asia and guarding against the rising threat of Japan. It was this railway that moved millions of peasant settlers east, fundamentally changing the demography of a continent. In India, the British Raj built one of the world's densest rail networks. Its purpose was twofold. First, to move the raw materials of the colony, the cotton from the interior, the tea from the hills of Assam, to the coastal ports of Bombay and Calcutta for shipment to the mills of Manchester. And second, and far more critically, it was a tool of military control, allowing the British to move their troops with lightning speed to any part of the subcontinent that dared to rebel, a lesson learned in blood and fire from the Great Mutiny of 1857. The Iron Horse had conquered the interiors, just as its twin, the steamship, had conquered the oceans. They were two halves of a single, global, coal-powered machine, a new circulatory system of steam and steel that was moving goods, people, and the armies at a pace that was unimaginable just a century before. This new integrated grid had now created a world that was fast, predictable, and relentlessly efficient. And in this new world of timetables and industrial speed, the old, slow, looping sea routes around the continents, the 13,000-mile journey around Cape Horn, the 12,000-mile journey around the Cape of Good Hope, were no longer just long. They were intolerable, an archaic, geographical friction in the gears of a machine that demanded, above all, the straightest possible line. The new integrated world of steam and steel, of railroads and iron-hulled ships, had become a single, pulsing global machine. But it was a machine that was grinding against the stubborn, ancient friction of geography itself. The continents of Africa and South America, which the Portuguese and Spanish had once so heroically rounded, were no longer seen as passages, but as colossal, intolerable barriers. In an age of timetables and coal-driven speed, The 12,000-mile journey from London to Mumbai around the Cape of Good Hope, or the 13,000-mile ordeal from New York to San Francisco around Cape Horn, was an anachronism, a glaring multi-thousand-mile inefficiency on the new, clean ledgers of global commerce. The logic of the railroad, which had blasted its way through the Sierra Nevada, was about to be applied to the very isthmuses that held the oceans apart. The 19th century engineer, armed with dynamite, steam shovels, and a boundless, almost arrogant sense of industrial confidence, was about to do what no pharaoh or emperor had ever truly succeeded in doing: cut the continents in half. The first and most obvious of these barriers was the narrow 120-mile strip of desert sand that connected Africa to Asia, the Isthmus of Suez. The dream of a canal here was an ancient one. Egyptian pharaohs, Persian kings like Darius, and even Roman emperors had all carved shallow, shifting canals that linked the Nile River to the Red Sea, a path for small galleys, but these had long since vanished, reclaimed by the desert, silted and forgotten. The new industrial age did not dream of a shallow, river-fed ditch. It dreamed of a Marmara, a true deep-water salt sea passage, a straight line that would sever the land bridge entirely and allow the largest steamships to sail directly from the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, and from there into the Indian Ocean. This was the vision of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a brilliant, charismatic, and relentlessly optimistic French diplomat who was neither an engineer nor a financier, but a supreme visionary and promoter, a man who could conjure capital and political will from the sheer force of his own personality. De Lesseps, who had served as a consul in Egypt, charmed the Egyptian ruler, Said Pasha, and in 1854 secured a concession to form the Suez Canal Company. The project was, from the start, a geopolitical battleground. France, under Napoleon III, championed the canal, seeing it as a way to restore French prestige and control the new dominant route to the east. The British Empire, in contrast, was violently, almost hysterically, opposed to it. Britain, as the world's dominant maritime power, liked the long route around the Cape of Good Hope, which its powerful navy, supported by its bases at Gibraltar, Sierra Leone, and Cape Town, completely controlled. A canal, they feared, would be a French lake, a vulnerable continental shortcut that would benefit its rivals and threaten its new, hard-won dominance in India. But de Lesseps, through a masterful campaign of public relations and engineering, pushed forward, raising the vast sums of money from French investors and beginning the decade-long assault on the desert in 1859. The construction was a tale of two eras. It began with the ancient, brutal methods of the pharaohs. Tens of thousands of Egyptian fellahin, or peasants, conscripted into forced labor, the corvée, digging the channel by hand with picks and baskets in the blistering, inhuman heat of the desert. The mortality rate from thirst, exhaustion, and cholera was appalling. But as international outrage grew and the labor source dried up, the project shifted, becoming a showcase of the new industrial age. Immense, steam-powered dredging machines, custom-built for the task, were floated into the channel, their iron buckets scooping up the mud and sand at a rate no human army could match. On November 17, 1869, the world watched, breathless. In a spectacular, fleet-filled ceremony, with the French Empress Eugenie's imperial yacht in the lead, the Suez Canal was opened. The Mediterranean and the Red Sea were one. The impact was not just immediate. It was total. The route from London to Mumbai was slashed by 4,500 miles, a saving of weeks. A new kind of ship, the Suezmax, was designed specifically to fit its dimensions. Britain, which had so bitterly opposed the canal, realized its folly, and in a brilliant geopolitical move by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, bought Egypt's bankrupt ruler's shares in 1875, securing financial and ultimately military control of the very artery it had once feared. The canal was no longer a French lake. It was the new, essential jugular vein of the British Empire, the lifeline to India. With Africa severed, the industrial world turned its gaze to the other Great Barrier, the narrow, jungle-choked, and disease-ridden Isthmus of Panama, the land bridge of the Americas. The challenge here was infinitely more complex. This was not a flat, dry, 50-foot-high sandbar like Suez. This was a 50-mile-wide spine of volcanic rock, a mountain range, the Cordillera, covered in an impenetrable jungle and subjected to torrential, flooding tropical rains. Worse, it was one of the deadliest places on Earth, a hot zone for two of humanity's most terrifying diseases, malaria and yellow fever. The great de Lesseps, now a global hero from his triumph at Suez, was convinced he could repeat his success. He formed a new company in 1881, promising to build a sea-level canal, just as he had at Suez, by simply blasting a trench through the mountains. It was a catastrophe. The French machinery, designed for desert sand, rusted and sank in the relentless mud. The Chagres River, which ran through the proposed route, would swell in the rains to a raging, uncontrollable torrent, washing away a season's work in a single night. But the true enemy was the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti and Anopheles mosquitoes, whose role in disease was not yet understood, transmitted yellow fever and malaria with terrifying efficiency. The French-run hospitals filled and emptied, the workers died by the thousands, their grave sites marked by small, white crosses that soon outnumbered the living. By 1889, the project had collapsed in the largest financial crash of the 19th century, a 2 billion franc ruin that had claimed an estimated 22,000 lives. The dream lay dormant, rotting in the jungle, until a new, aggressive, and expansionist power, the United States, decided it needed the canal for its own imperial ambitions. President Theodore Roosevelt, a disciple of sea power, had seen the need firsthand when the battleship USS Oregon had been forced to make the 14,000-mile, 2-month dash around Cape Horn to join the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt, with his famous mantra, "I took the canal," backed a Panamanian revolution against Colombia, created a new puppet state, and in 1904 took control of the abandoned, rusting French works. The American effort, led by brilliant engineers like John Frank Stevens, was a masterpiece of logistics and, crucially, a war on disease. A U.S. Army doctor, William C. Gorgas, was given a blank check to wage a total, uncompromising war on the mosquito. He drained every swamp, fumigated every house, and covered every water cistern, eradicating yellow fever and bringing malaria under control. With the workforce now safe, the engineers abandoned de Lesseps' sea-level fantasy. Instead, they built a water bridge. They dammed the raging Chagres River, creating the massive artificial Gatun Lake, and then built a series of 3 colossal concrete locks, the largest ever conceived, to lift the world's largest ships up 85 feet to the level of this new lake. The ships would then sail in fresh water 30 miles across the top of the continent, before a final set of locks would lower them back down to the sea. When the SS Ancon made the first official transit on August 15th, 1914, the world had been fundamentally redrawn. The 8,000-mile shortcut had turned the United States into a true two-ocean power, its navy and its commerce now able to move, at will, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. These two great canals, these two man-made straits, were the final triumphalist acts of the industrial age, the ultimate expression of steam and steel's victory over the ancient, stubborn, and now, finally, conquered friction of the natural world. The two great canals, those monumental cuts through Suez and Panama, were the final, triumphant acts of the age of steam and steel, the ultimate expression of industrial power over the friction of geography. The new 20th century world was now fully wired, a globe laced with submarine telegraph cables, bound by steel rails and crossed by steamships that ran on predictable, relentless schedules. The time it took to cross the oceans had been compressed from months to weeks, and then to mere days, and yet, for all this incredible machine-driven speed, a strange and costly paradox remained. A massive, multi-thousand-ton cargo ship, a colossal investment of capital, could now race across the Atlantic in 5 days. But it would then spend the next 2 weeks tied to a dock, idle and hemorrhaging money, while a chaotic, centuries-old process of loading and unloading unfolded piece by agonizing piece. The machine age had mastered the sea, but it remained utterly defeated by the shore. This was the bottleneck, the great unseen friction of the mid-20th century. The system was called breakbulk cargo, and it was a scene of organized chaos that a Phoenician or Venetian merchant would have instantly recognized. The docks of New York, London, or Hamburg were a frantic, crowded, and dangerous world of men and muscle. Thousands of longshoremen, their shoulders hardened by the work, would swarm over a ship descending into its deep holds. They were the men who stuffed the holds, and their job was to manually move every single item. Cargo arrived in a baffling, non-standardized blizzard of shapes: wooden crates of machinery, burlap sacks of coffee, barrels of wine, bales of cotton, pallets of bricks, individual bunches of bananas. Each piece had to be painstakingly lifted by a man's back or wrestled into a rope sling, winched out of the hold by a small dockside crane, swung over to the pier, and then resorted, repiled, and reloaded onto a wagon or a truck. The process was not just slow, it was ruinously expensive, prone to massive theft or pilferage, and constantly crippled by breakage and damage. It was said that the cost of moving a crate the last 50 feet from the ship's hold to the truck on the pier was often more than the entire cost of sailing it 3,000 miles from Europe. The solution to this profound inefficiency came not from a shipping magnate, not from a naval architect, or a global financier. It came from a man who hated the sea. His name was Malcolm McLean, and he was a trucker. He was a tough, pragmatic, and obsessively cost-conscious entrepreneur who had built a large trucking company in North Carolina, and he viewed the entire shipping industry with the profound frustration of an outsider. The seed of his idea was planted, the legend goes, way back in 1937, when he was a young driver sitting in his cab for an entire wasted day at a port in New Jersey, watching his own bales of cotton being slowly, manually unloaded from his truck, and just as slowly, just as manually, loaded onto a ship. He looked at his truck trailer, and he looked at the ship, and he thought to himself, "Why am I watching men move the cargo? Why can't I just move the box?" This simple, revolutionary idea, intermodalism, would not let him go. Decades passed. McLean built his trucking empire, but he kept circling the problem. In the 1950s, he finally acted. He sold his entire trucking company, a massive gamble, and poured the money into buying a small, struggling World War II surplus shipping line called the Pan-Atlantic Steamship Company. He then modified an old T2 oil tanker, a ship named the Ideal X, reinforcing its deck to carry not loose cargo in its hold, but something new. He had built 58 large, uniform, stackable steel boxes, each 35 feet long, the exact size of his old truck trailers. On April 26, 1956, a date that should be far more famous than it is, the Ideal X was loaded at the port of Newark. A specially designed crane simply lifted the 58 boxes, one by one, from their truck chassis and placed them onto the ship's deck. The entire loading process took a matter of hours. The longshoremen on the dock watched in stunned, anxious silence, a few reportedly shouting that they would sink the ship, sensing in that moment the end of their entire way of life. The Ideal X then sailed from Newark to Houston. Upon arrival, the 58 boxes were simply lifted off, locked onto 58 waiting truck chassis, and driven away, their seals unbroken, their cargo untouched by human hands since it had left the factory. The revolution had begun. McLean's calculations were vindicated, and the results were staggering. The cost of loading and unloading a ton of cargo, which in the old breakbulk system was $5.86, plummeted overnight to just 16 cents. The time a ship spent in port, that great profit-killing vampire, was reduced from weeks to hours. The ship was now in perpetual motion, doing what it was built to do: carry goods. Theft, damage, and insurance costs evaporated because the cargo was now secure, anonymous, and protected inside a sealed, corrugated steel vault. But the true genius was not just the box, it was the system it created. This was the final, perfect integration of the industrial transportation grid. The same humble box could start its life in a factory in the deep interior, be loaded onto a truck, driven to a rail yard, clipped onto the iron horse we visited, carried 1,000 miles to a port, lifted by a giant new portainer crane, and stacked on a ship. This ship would sail 8,000 miles across the Pacific, where the box would be lifted off, placed on another train, and then on another truck, to be delivered to a warehouse in another continent, its contents never once seen or touched. The container, this simple, standardized box, was the universal adapter, the missing link that finally connected the truck, the train, and the ship into one single, seamless global machine. The final step, and the one that cemented the revolution, was standardization. For a time, every company, from McLean's Sealand to his new rivals, had their own proprietary box sizes, a new Tower of Babel. The true catalyst for a global standard came from the U.S. military, which during the Vietnam War saw the container's logistical genius. The military, in partnership with the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, forced the entire chaotic industry to agree on the dimensions we know today. The standard 20-foot box, a 20-foot equivalent unit, or TEU, and its 40-foot big brother, complete with the standardized 8-hold corner castings that any crane on any continent could lock on to. This was the final piece. The old, finger-like piers of New York's Manhattan waterfront became obsolete overnight, and vast, new, alien landscapes were built. The massive, flat, sprawling container ports of Port Elizabeth, Felixstowe, Rotterdam, and later, the colossal automated ports of Singapore and Shanghai, cities of pure logistics, where robots and algorithms now move millions of these boxes in a ceaseless 24-hour-a-day ballet. This humble box, born of a trucker's frustration, was the true engine of modern globalization, all but eliminating the cost of distance, and in doing so, it set the stage for the final, invisible trade route that now defines our modern world. The humble, standardized steel box, Malcolm McLean's pragmatic solution to a trucker's frustration, was the final masterpiece of the physical age. It was the capstone on an edifice of trade built over millennia, an idea so perfect in its simplicity that it made the movement of atoms, the grain, the textiles, the machinery, the things of our world, almost an afterthought, a problem so completely solved that the cost of distance itself seemed to evaporate from the ledgers of commerce. The container, running on its global, integrated grid of ships, trains, and trucks, had conquered the world of matter. But as this new, hyper-efficient physical grid was locking into place, a new and final trade route was already being woven, a route that was entirely silent, entirely invisible, and destined to carry a commodity of almost infinite value, a commodity that weighed nothing at all. This was the trade in bits, not atoms. This was the dawn of the digital Silk Roads, the final abstract network of pure information. This new route also required a new infrastructure, a new kind of road to be built. But this road was not carved from desert rock or paved with Roman stone. It was a web of pure light, a global nervous system spun from glass. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating with a frantic dot-com-fueled boom, specialized cable ships began to lay fiber optic cables on the ocean floor, the new silent highways for this invisible cargo. And in a quiet, beautiful echo of history, these new hair-thin glass fibers were often laid in the very same undersea trenches that had been carved a century earlier for the first clunky copper telegraph cables, which themselves had followed the familiar, profitable paths of the great steamships. The main arteries of this new digital world ran from London to New York, from California to Tokyo, and most critically, through the very same narrow, vital choke points of global trade: the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Mediterranean. These ancient physical bottlenecks, once navigated by Vasco da Gama's caravels, were now home to the world's most concentrated and most vulnerable flows of data. The ships on this new route are not wooden hulls or steel plates, but tiny, precise pulses of laser light, packets of information that flicker and race through the glass fibers at nearly the speed of light. The cargo they carry is the very ether of our modern economy. It is the instantaneous, multi-trillion-dollar transaction of the global financial markets, a high-frequency trade executed by an algorithm in a microsecond, a river of digital currency that dwarfs the silver of Potosi. It is the blueprint for a new microchip designed by an engineer in California, digitally sent to a foundry in Taiwan, its path guided by a logistics update from a shipping container computer in Singapore. It is the software code written by a team in Bangalore, emailed to a firm in Berlin. It is the medical scan the MRI of a patient in Dubai, being analyzed in real time by a specialist in Cleveland. It is the university lecture, the human voice and the image, the whispered bedtime story, streaming from a server in Virginia to a listener in a quiet room, perhaps like this one, anywhere on the planet. The great, bustling ports of this new trade are no longer the chaotic, noisy docks of the breakbulk era, or even the vast automated fields of the container terminals. The new entrepôts are the data centers, the new, silent, and anonymous fortresses of the digital age. These are vast, windowless, and intensely refrigerated warehouses, often built in cold, remote places, by an Arctic fjord in Norway, in the cool mists of Ireland, or on the windy plains of Oregon, wherever power is cheap and the air is cold enough to cool the millions of high-speed servers that are the new, humming electronic storehouses for the world's information. This is where the world's cargo now sits in port, in the form of a cloud, waiting to be summoned by a click. The trade that began with a physical, tangible object, a bead of amber, a block of salt, a peppercorn, has completed its long journey into pure, weightless abstraction. And so, our long journey, which began with the first, slow, hand-to-hand movement of a single piece of northern gold, has come to this. A world bound so tightly, so instantaneously, that geography itself has almost ceased to matter, a global, integrated machine of atoms and bits, a network that moves both the steel box and the pulse of light that tracks it. The human desire that set that first trader walking south, the desire for connection, for beauty, for profit, for the thing that lies just over the horizon, has never changed. It has only accelerated, its pathways growing wider, faster, and now, finally, invisible. The same impulse that drove Zhang Qian into the unknown, that pulled Vasco da Gama around the storm, that inspired the humble revolutionary logic of a trucker, has now spun a web of pure thought that enfolds the entire globe. This web is humming, silent and unseen, even now. As you rest, as the world outside your window grows quiet, these digital silk roads are alive beneath the deepest, blackest trenches of the ocean, carrying the dreams, the commerce, and the conversations of a planet that is, for the first time in its long, slow history, truly and irrevocably connected as one. The long story of our trade, of our restless human need to reach out, to exchange, and to build, has brought us here. And now, the journey is complete. The roots are drawn, the connections are made, and the world sleeps, bound at last by a million threads of glass, and steel, and memory. Rest now.